Great to see everybody. Good morning. Happy Saturday. If folks want to test their audio, feel free to unmute yourself and
Good morning.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Aloha.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Good morning.
And friendly reminder too, if you haven't had a chance to name yourself, your first name, comma, and then your location. That would be great.
Forget how to do that.
Oh yeah, great. So if you hover over your name, if you see the participant panel and you hover over your name and there's a button that says more, you click on more and you should see the rename option. You see that?
I don't see it.
Okay. So,
The chat.
Isn't that the three dots?
It's in the upper right corner of your picture.
Oh, okay. Thank
listen
you.
to them, not me. I'm not the or Brent. Listen to Brent. He's our tech guy.
Three dots is perfect. Click that. Should give you that option.
Giving technical advice ever.
Yeah, it's all different depending on if you're an iPad or a laptop or
Okay.
a computer. So
Great. And for those that just rolled in and joined us, feel free to unmute yourself and test your audio.
I think my audio is okay. This is Kathy Auburn,
Yes. Good morning.
but I don't have a picture. It says no available camera input, but I hit my Snapchat. Let me try it again.
Okay.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Not Snapchat.
Good morning from John and Olympia.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Good morning from Bellingham.
Good morning, Corbin.
I guess I won't have camera today
Okay.
until my daughter gets down.
Okay. And Brent is on the line too, and we'll be sharing Brent's information in the chat in just a second as well.
Okay.
Yes, I'll post it right now.
Okay. Great.
Good morning. Good morning, everyone.
Hey, good morning, Chief.
Good morning. Excellent. So we are officially at 10 o'clock. And so in the interest of starting right on time, even though it's a Saturday morning, I know that's a tall order for everybody. If you want to take one last stretch, or if you want to stand up, unmute yourself, say woohoo, Washington Climate Assembly, whatever it takes. It's great to see everybody. Thank you all so much for being here. I know folks are going to be rolling in as we get started. But just want to formally and informally welcome everybody to our learning session number 5. We will be meeting from 10 a.m. to 1 p.m. today. And as we've been doing since the start, if folks can just let us know in one word how you're doing this morning. One word that describes kind of where you're at or what you're thinking as you enter into this Washington Climate Assembly space this morning.
Well, I'm glad to be back. I was in the hospital for 2 of the meetings, but I'm doing fine now and I'm home.
Great. Glad to hear that. Okay. You're here, tired, ready to learn, focused, ready, awake and ready, tired, ready to learn. Great. What else did I miss? Ready. If anybody else wants to share how they're feeling this morning, let us know. And
Ready for anything.
Ready for anything. I like that attitude. Can do attitude, right? Wonderful. Woke up happy. Good to hear it. All right. And just making sure from a tech side, Brent, are we all set on the live streaming end?
we are all good. Thank you.
Okay. All right. Here to learn. Great. So just wanting to start our meeting, formally welcome all of you. Thank you all so much for being here. We are going to start with a land acknowledgement and then just a couple of housekeeping items before we get into today's agenda. So land acknowledgement, we wish to acknowledge that the people of Washington State live and work on tribal lands of the indigenous people who've been here since time immemorial. There are 29 federally recognized tribes, 7 non-federally recognized tribes within the boundaries of Washington State. Tribes and tribal people bring thousands of years of traditional knowledge to our present moment. Tribes bring an important and vital voice to the current conversation, and we honor our tribal relations. All right, excellent. And quick reminders for folks that are just joining, we've got some good other reflections on where they are, scattered, well rested. Thank you all so much for being honest about exactly where you are in this moment. All right, quick reminder, if you are a presenter, first name, last name, and comma presenter. If you are an assembly member, your first name and location. For those folks that haven't had a chance to do that just yet, we can help you as well, but wanting just first name and location. And then we do have a few observers as well that have joined us, and they are listed as first name, last name, comma, observer. And with that, we just put Brent's information, our fearless tech leader, is here for you if anything happens at any time during this call, or if you are having trouble of any sort from an audio standpoint, visual standpoint, either give him a call, send him an email, send him a text, and he is here to help you. And with that, I will turn it over to Mike to get us oriented to our agenda for the day.
Great, thank you, Gretchen. And 1 second as we pull up the presentation.
And Mike, maybe you just want to get started on the agenda as we're doing it.
So great, well, thank you all today. So like all of our Saturday sessions, we have 2 parts today. So we'll have a part 1, we're going to hear from a series of presenters, we'll have a Q&A period, and then we'll have a break. And then we'll reconvene for part 2, hear from another set of presenters, Q&A, and then we'll again have our reflections around the campfire, which we've been doing for the past few sessions, and then identify some next steps. So thinking about what we heard from the last learning session and just continuing to remind ourselves of all of the different types of content and presentations we've been hearing from. So this past Tuesday, we heard from Matt Stewart on the trade-offs between acting on climate change versus waiting for future climate impacts to happen, or the cost of inaction, or the cost if we do nothing. Matt also talked about how we can evaluate some of the upfront costs versus some of the future costs when we weigh policies and decisions. We learned from Moji Egan on what a circular economy means and some upcoming legislation in Washington state about moving towards a more circular economy. We learned from Peter Godleski from the Association of Washington Businesses about the role of business and their priorities to enact climate solutions. And finally, we had 2 presenters, Brad Warren and Bob Hallahan, presenting on a variety of carbon pricing models, including cap and trade, price and reinvest, and carbon taxes, and the history of these policies in Washington. So thinking about where, again, we're sitting, we've heard the introductions of climate change. What are the causes? What's driving the climate to change? We learned about some of the impacts and some of the social considerations about how these impacts might be felt unequally. We learned about the impacts of climate change to the environment and the potential for some environmental solutions to support climate mitigation. And then we learned some of the economics of climate change as well. So thinking about what's the role of the economy or the market to play for climate mitigation solutions. And today we're going to hear from a series of experts and interested parties on what are some of the technical issues, considerations, and opportunities for solutions for climate mitigation as well. So I'm going to hand this over to Derek Hoshiko, to one of our other facilitators to do a waterfall chat.
Right, thank you so much, Mike. Yeah, I wanted to really take a moment, and we're about halfway through these learning sessions and really want to take it down to where we can reflect on, because there's so much learning that's happened. We've heard from so many speakers. It's been such an incredible experience. So we're going to do a little activity. It'll just take about a minute, and it's called Waterfall Chat. And so what you'll do is I'll be sharing a prompt, and you'll go into the chat if you can. And what you'll do is you'll type your answer to the question, and don't actually hit enter until I say 3, 2, 1, go. And once we do that, everyone's answers will happen at the same time, and it's this surprising. You'll see. I think you'll really enjoy it. But so the prompt is, what is one thing that you've learned that surprised you or stands out from the last several learning sessions? So again, feel free to take about 30 seconds to reflect, and then type your answer to the prompt into the chat, but don't hit enter until we're ready to all do it at the same time. So take 30 seconds to reflect on what is one thing that you've learned that surprised you or stands out. So 30 seconds. Maybe you've taken some notes and there's something you've just circled, or maybe you remember one of the speakers and that's a reminder of something that stood out, or just you were at a meal and talking with someone in your community about something that you learned. So just, yeah, what is one thing that you've learned that surprised you or stands out? And put your thumbs up if you think you're ready to hit the enter key. Thumbs up if you're ready. Some people are ready, getting ready. Don't do it yet. All right, bunch of thumbs up, almost ready. Okay, 3, 2, 1, hit enter. Go ahead and paste those in. All right, look at all these great answers. Things people are surprised about, things people learned. Thank you so much for sharing about that. I think it is important to take a step back and reflect and to really sit with those things. So I'm going to pass it back to Mike. And thank you so much for participating in Waterfall Chat. And we might use that again. I think we will be using that again later today with a different prompt. So thanks for practicing.
Great. Thanks, Derek. Well, that feels like a good segue. It seems like there's a lot of content here. And so thinking about what we're going to learn about today and what are today's learning objectives. So today we're going to learn about the source of Washington's greenhouse gas emissions and the opportunities to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and mitigate climate change in different sectors from multiple experts and interested parties. This includes the energy sector. So thinking about questions about where does Washington state energy come from? The buildings, how much heat or energy do our homes or workplaces use? Transportation, what are the means in which we travel, and thinking about it through those lenses. And then again, throughout all of these presentations, we're going to be learning about upcoming state legislation or other opportunities to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. Again, we wanted to remind people that we do have two different types of presenters: experts who are subject matter experts educating from their experience and education, and interested parties are people who have a stake or are directly affected by the issues and bringing their personal perspectives to this. And again, last time we heard that people really liked being reminded about the climate assembly questions. So moving forward, we're just going to include this as a reminder for folks. And so we're here because we want to deliberate on and provide solutions to the question we have here. How can Washington state equitably design and implement climate mitigation strategies while strengthening communities disproportionately impacted by climate change? And so as you listen to each of our presenters today, again, keep this question in mind and think about the recommendations that might help answer this question. Each of our presenters are sharing their expertise and potential recommendations with you, and this is a great lens to work from. We'll, of course, be diving into the recommendations during our deliberative sessions in the next couple of weeks. And so finally, we wanted to just call out, at the end of our last learning session, we did a similar type of chat exercise and trying to gauge how people were feeling about how they were learning. And one word I think really stuck out to our coordinating team, and that was the word overwhelmed when we asked you to put that one word in the chat. And so we just want to acknowledge that this is a very honest and real word. And so wanting to take a moment to take that word and reflect on it, especially as your role from a Washington Climate Assembly member. You're hearing some of the best available science from experts on a range of topics that have dedicated most, if not their entire lives, to studying and working in the climate change space, and hearing from local perspectives around this complicated issue. Your role, again, is to actively listen and ask great questions, both of which you all have been doing, and thinking about what this all means to you and your fellow Assembly members, and ultimately for Washington State. If you need support, please reach out to the coordinating team via chat here, email, text. And if you have questions for the presenters, again, wanting to remind you, ask anything in the chat for the presenters, and things that we don't get to during the session, we'll be following up via email with all of our presenters. All right, I'm going to turn it back over to Gretchen now.
Thank you so much, Mike. And I know we've shown you the screen a couple of times, but we did want to toggle over both to the resource folder as well as to where on our website, because we know the website is dense. There's a lot of information there. So where on the website, if there is any independent research you want to share with your fellow Assembly members, where you can also submit a recommendation. We just wanted to reorient you to both of those places. And so Wendy is going to share her screen, take us away from the PowerPoint, and just reorient everybody to remind folks where on the website is the place where you can do each of these things.
Hi, everyone. Yeah, so 1 second. I'm gonna put a note in here in the chat. So this is a link to our, on our webpage. You can find all our surveys there, and this is where you can give feedback to us. I'll just scroll on the screen. So once you get to this page, if you scroll to the bottom here, you'll find a few forms. You can give us feedback on our learning sessions. You can submit recommendations. And if you also want us to upload something onto our shared folder, you can just plug that into our independent research survey. Our folder is view only. So if you want us to put something in there, you do have to either email us or submit this survey. And I'll put the link to that folder again into the chat right now.
Great. Thank you so much, Wendy. And with that, we are going to move into our first set of presentations today. And our first presenter is Eileen Quigley, who will be presenting on greenhouse gas emission reduction pathways as an expert presenter. Eileen is the founding executive director of the Clean Energy Transition Institute, which advances strategies to achieve deep decarbonization in the Northwest. And the learning objective from her presentation to learn about Washington greenhouse gas emissions sources and the possible pathways for emissions reductions. Welcome, Eileen. Thanks so much for being here today.
Thank you very much. Let me see if I can share my screen. Okay, this and this. Okay. Thank you so very much, first and foremost, to all of you who are participating today. This is such an impressive effort. And from the very beginning, when I was approached by Wendy and Mike, I was so excited to be able to be with you, and so grateful to you for your efforts. And a quick thanks to Mike and Wendy also for all of their work. This is obviously, and everybody else who's involved, Derek, Gretchen. This is obviously a huge endeavor and an incredibly important one. I am going to very briefly describe the Institute. I've been asked to review what deep decarbonization pathways are explain Washington's greenhouse gas emissions, and apply a decarbonization pathways framework based on the work my team did last year helping the Department of Commerce craft a 10-year energy strategy. So that's the agenda. So the Clean Energy Transition Institute is an independent, nonpartisan Northwest research and analysis organization, and our mission is to transform to a clean energy economy in the Northwest by advancing equitable, economic, and technical deep decarbonization strategies. We focus exclusively on the Northwest in the context of the broader Western energy world, and we provide neutral data, analytics, and best practices about decarbonization, which enables fact-based conversations among stakeholders and policymakers and citizens about the smartest strategies and actions and policies to pursue to decrease carbon emissions as swiftly as the climate science tells us we must. We take a systemic, holistic approach, as decarbonization is all about multiple approaches that cut across different energy sectors. And we believe that governments, utilities, businesses, advocates, stakeholders, community groups, and citizens need unbiased analysis from a data-driven organization to advance these policies that will put us quickly on the path to implementing viable, equitable solutions. We developed the Northwest Deep Decarbonization Pathways Study to provide a baseline of information about how to achieve a low-carbon economy in the 4 states of the Northwest: Washington, Oregon, Idaho, and Montana. We thought it would be valuable if stakeholders had a common set of assumptions from which to make choices about which pathways to pursue when. That work led to the work we did last year for the Washington State Energy Strategy and work we did in Montana for an advisory committee that Governor Bullock had stood up, and work we're doing now in Oregon to help Oregon stakeholders craft a more aggressive clean energy standard and update their GHG emissions targets. These are the 5 key strategies that underpin decarbonization pathways. The results you're seeing here are from the Northwest Deep Decarbonization Pathway Study, but what I want you to focus on more is just what the pathways are. So energy efficiency is the bedrock strategy, and for the simple reason that the less energy you need, the less you use, and that helps reduce emissions right away. So if the energy is produced with fossil fuels, then you already are able to get reduction by not using it. And then of course, the less you need to generate, the less emissions you'll have. We know that the future is largely an electrified one with as many uses as possible, powered by clean electricity. And that means we're going to need a lot more electricity to meet demand. And we also know it's going to take time for lots of clean energy to be on the grid and transmitted. So the more we can do to decrease energy, the better off we are. Strategy 2 and 3 go hand in hand. We need to clean our grid as quickly as possible, and we need to switch to as many uses that are currently powered by coal, gas, oil, diesel, or propane to clean energy. But not all uses can be electrified, and so for those liquid fuels that we will still need, say for planes, ships, long-haul trucking, and other processes, we must make them as low carbon as possible. Finally, for uses that can be neither electrified nor converted to low carbon fuels, we must sequester those emissions or use them to produce clean synthetic fuels. Here I'm showing you what's known as a Sinki chart, and you read it from left to right. So this is for Washington State 2018. This shows you energy sources on the left and energy uses on the right. This is a handy way to understand very quickly the proportion of clean to dirty energy and to see how each of the sectors is powered. So follow with me as I go down the left, starting with electricity. So you see that our electricity in the state, which is the orange box, is fed by some solar, nuclear, hydro, wind, natural gas, coal, some biomass, and then you see where the orange lines go to power the different sectors: residential, commercial, industrial, and transportation. You also see there's a yellow line from solar that powers some commercial uses, and that geothermal in brown powers both residential and commercial uses, as does biomass in light green. That light blue for natural gas powers all 4 sectors, and oil is used in both transport and industrial uses. So now I'm going to give you a very high-level sense of what Washington is attempting to do and what the state energy strategy is designed to address. In the 2020 legislative session, Washington updated the greenhouse gas limits that had been set in 2008, and they established ambitious economy-wide goals. 95% reduction below 1990 levels by 2050, with interim and economy-wide emission limits of 45% below 1990 levels by 2030 and 70% below 1990 levels by 2040. In addition, the state has committed to a net zero emission target by 2050, and that means that residual emissions, which are about 5% of emissions in 2050, will need to be balanced by an equivalent amount of biological or geological emissions removal from the atmosphere. These targets require transformative and aggressive action. Here I'm showing you, with a sort of split screen, our historical emissions from 1990, which is our base year, and then what the modeling shows we would need to do in order to get to those targets by 2050. This is another way of looking at our both challenge and opportunity. We do call this the 2030 challenge because we need to reduce 53% reductions by then, and this is quite a significant target. The thing that I want you to understand from this is that Washington is both blessed by its extremely clean electricity, all that hydro you saw before in the Sankey chart, and the wind. But that also means that our 2030 target is very challenging. In other states, in fact, in Oregon, where we're working right now, where they still have a lot of coal on the grid, they have an easier time of hitting a 2030 target because they can remove the coal, and the coal is already being removed. So Washington has to address some of the tougher to reduce areas, in particular transportation. So we did a wide range of analyses, did scenarios with our deep decarbonization pathways, and we looked at an electrification case, we looked at keeping gas in buildings, we looked at whether we would have trouble if we couldn't transmit as much power as we need. And across all of our scenarios, each of which hit the target, there were some common findings. One of the key ones is how important it is for us to have a strengthened and expanded Western grid to take advantage of resources and geographic diversity. Specifically, by 2050, we anticipate that we will be using a great deal of wind from the inland states, particularly Montana and Wyoming, at least at the utility scale. And so this raises all kinds of interesting challenges and opportunities in terms of transmission capacity and governance issues, and having us figure out how we're going to all share our different resources. We also took a look all across the Western grid, so we're also assuming that we'll be receiving some solar from California and from New Mexico and Arizona, and this all raises a lot of challenges. Thirdly, we know that we're going to need a large clean fuels industry based on biofuels and hydrogen, and there are significant challenges here because several technologies are not at scale yet or at cost, and others end up having a wide range of uses for different biomass or different feedstocks, and we have to make decisions about what we're going to use them all for. In terms of the clean fuels, as I said before, we really are going to have to figure out gasoline, diesel, jet fuel sooner than some other parts of the country. And a lot of these technologies are nascent, and the modeling shows that in order to meet our 2030 targets, we might invest in technologies for 2030 that we might not need in 2050. So there are very important choices that we have to make now. The other piece is these interesting opportunities for hydrogen, and a big part of what we have to do with hydrogen is figure out what's real and what's hype. So implications, deep energy efficiency, as I spoke about before, we will likely have a clean electricity grid. We certainly are supposed to by law. That's what the Clean Energy Transformation Act is telling us to do. And we will be trying to electrify as many end uses as possible, a regional approach. My last slide is just a list of the issues that were raised from this, some of which I've touched upon. But I think what I want to talk about here, aside from all these technical issues, is equity. And the deep decarbonization pathways modeling approach is a least cost approach. And so it gives us direction and it helps frame technical choices. But the economic lens that it's using is really about the costs of technology and the state of where the technology is at different times. And it is not the best tool to examine the equity implications of decarbonization. And so when I look at, say, for example, the challenges we might have with getting enough transmission and enough resource, new resource, new wind, new solar, et cetera. I'm particularly interested in exploring distributed energy resources, both to relieve the pressure there on the utility scale, but more importantly, to enable energy independence, and to have local communities have more control over their energy destinies, and be able to give people who jobs in communities and have those jobs be driven by the communities. There are multiple other examples that I could give you, but I don't have the time in terms of all of these different issues that have arisen out of the work we've done. But I think that probably the most important one is to figure out how, as we make this transformation, which we know is going to be huge, how we can do it in an equitable way and address not just the technical challenges we have, but the societal challenges we have had. A specific example that I'll give you as I close is that we did an energy burden mapping for our state energy strategy and discovered, which probably may not be a surprise to a lot of people here, but that Ferry and Okanagan counties have the most heavily energy burdened populations, and these are where Native communities live. And it just seems to me that we have an enormous opportunity here to address not just our climate challenges, but also the historic ways that we have not taken care of all of our communities. Thank you very much.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Eileen. I appreciate you being here and sharing your information. And with that, we will go right into our next speaker, Nancy Hirsch, who will be presenting on energy policies as an expert presenter. Nancy is the Executive Director for the Northwest Energy Coalition and directs its efforts to enhance investments in energy efficiency, renewable resources, and low-income energy services. Learning objective here is to learn about the ins and outs of energy in Washington State, both from the infrastructure, the energy sources, utility side, and the role that they can play to reduce statewide greenhouse gas emissions. Thanks so much for being here, Nancy.
Great, thank you so much, Gretchen. And thank you all for being here. And Wendy, thanks for your help in staying on top of getting my materials into you all. It's a pleasure to be here this morning. So again, my name's Nancy Hirsch, the Executive Director of the Northwest Energy Coalition. And we're an alliance of about 100 organizations across the 4 Northwest states, Oregon, Idaho, Washington, and Montana, a little bit in British Columbia. And our membership goes from the nonprofit environmental, consumer, low-income civic organizations to energy efficiency and renewable energy businesses, and some electric and fossil gas utilities. And we are really at that nexus of the utility sector, both electricity and the gas sector, and other sectors. So our work is primarily focused around utilities and then their relationship to buildings, their relationship to transportation, and the power sector's relationship to fish and wildlife. And while this, I just got to point out this slide, this picture on this slide, it's from 2006. So it's a little dated, clean energy, but those are my kids holding up that sign at the rally when we submitted all the signatures in July to put Initiative 937, the first clean energy standard for the state. So anyway, I like this picture, even though it's a little dated. All right, hang on, let's keep moving. Hang on, how come I can't, there we go. Okay, so again, this is our mission. And so we work on the cleaning up the grid, cleaning up the gas system, creating opportunities in buildings and transportation, and reducing the impact of our power system on fish and wildlife, particularly Columbia Basin salmon and steelhead. So what I'm going to talk about today is the utility sector and energy related to driving our utilities, what the existing policies that we already have in place, the landscape that's changing in the energy sector related to a lot of the information that Eileen provided. And then please keep those questions coming in the chat and we'll get to them during the Q&A session. So here's the landscape for utilities in our state. We have one electric-only utility, two utilities that provide both electricity and fossil gas for direct use, and then we have two fossil gas utilities, and these are on the private utility side. Then Washington is a little unique in our utility landscape. We have about 63 public utilities in our state. Many states do not have very many public utilities. We happen to have quite a number. And those range from municipal, like Seattle City Light, which is part of the local government, and Tacoma Power, which is again a city agency, to public utility districts where they have elected commissioners, cooperatives where they're community owned, and something called mutuals, which are also community owned. They're a little derivative of a cooperative. And next I want to look at where our power comes from on the electric side. So this is the utilities in the state are all required to submit their power supply to the state Department of Commerce so that we can track what the fuel mix is by utility and writ large across the state. So these are the statewide numbers. Each utility's mix is going to be different, but this is the state's numbers from 2019. And you might think, wow, the wind number is kind of low because our renewable energy standard says by 2019, we should be at 9%. And one of the reasons that the number, and now that we're in 2020, that number should be 15% based on our requirements.
There we go. Is this,
can
you hear me
partly
okay?
it's a reporting lag. And also some of the utilities, some of the wind that's produced in this state isn't used in this state. So there is a mix there. But I expect when we see the 2020 numbers, that wind percentage will go back up to
so
where
are
it's supposed to
you,
be.
just double checking,
Because
are you on
the
a laptop
accounting
or are
now
you,
will have to have caught up. There's a little bit of a lag.
and I missed,
But as you
sorry,
can
the
see,
audio was cutting out
hydropower
for
is our
me.
biggest
Was
source of energy.
at the very beginning when
And
you first
because
joined,
we're so
was this when it happened?
reliant on hydropower, that hydropower number varies depending on the weather and the amount of precipitation we've had. So some years,
you can't
that
get, so,
hydropower number will be close to 68%
down in the bottom left,
if it's a wet year. 2019 actually was kind of a dry year. So
do you
the
see
amount
where
of,
it has
of the
the
fossil
unmute,
fuels, natural
the mute
gas,
thing on
coal,
the
and the unspecified
but you
resources
can't
are
hear.
resources that come from market
Okay,
purchases.
okay,
And
that's
those
okay.
are usually
So there's a little up
natural
arrow right next to
gas
that mute sign.
with some
You see
coal
the
in
little,
them.
if you click that,
And
click where it
those
says
go
test
down
speaker and
when
microphone.
the hydro system is producing more resources and we have more rain or more snow. And one of the challenges with climate
Yeah, but the
change
mute
is that
mute
we're
button is for
seeing
you, so we can't
more
hear you.
precipitation in the form of rain
Can you change
rather
the speaker?
than
Then you have
snow.
it on that little up
And
arrow.
snow is a great storage
There's it says
system
select speaker.
for
Can you
the
select different
hydroelectric
speaker?
system. The more rain that comes down means the water goes right into the reservoirs,
Can
and the
you-
reservoirs have a harder time holding it back because they have limited storage.
Can you hear
So
other
we
noises on
like
the computer, or is everything muted?
precipitation coming as snow because it's an automatic storage system. So there presents challenges for our hydro operators and puts stress on the hydro system going forward.
If you
The
click on
more
your,
our precipitation comes as rain.
Can you double check that the whole thing is not muted?
I want to go back. Whoops. Whoop, wait a minute. I wanted to go back. All right. Well, how do I go back? Let's see. There we go. All right. One last thing. Clean. When you ask about the definition of what's
Where
clean
the volume control
electricity,
is? Okay.
I think the one resource that is
Volume up and
debated the
down, do you
most
hear it
is
ding
nuclear.
at you?
It doesn't have
So,
any
on the
immediate
very far
emissions,
left,
but it
is there
has
a red
other
X?
environmental impacts and
so
safety
click that
impacts.
X.
So
That's the
within
mute
the debate about
So
clean
if you click
electricity,
that X,
nuclear
does
is
it
the
go away?
one that is the most debated as to whether it is considered clean or not. Now I want to move on to the natural gas, fossil gas sector. This provides you just a quick picture on the left is the gas system and the pipelines and the service territory of where natural gas is used primarily in our state. And those most of our natural fossil gas comes from Canada.
So I would try rebooting
and
your
then
computer
from the Rocky
and see if
Mountains.
if it doesn't.
Historically, almost all of our natural gas
you can
came
just
from
join in
Canada.
that way. It'd be,
And in the 90s and in early 2000s, a pipeline was
Or
built
if
from
you-
the Rocky Mountains
or
into the
if you
the
want,
west, into the
what you can
northwest.
do
And so
is,
now our gas is a little more diversified.
mute
On the
button
right
is
side, you can see this again relates to
screen,
the
bottom
chart
left
that
one,
Eileen showed.
on
This is a
Zoom.
little bit
If
older,
you
so her
click there, it
chart
should
is
say
more accurate.
switch to phone
But it
audio.
just kind of
You see where
shows you
that
in a
is?
pie-shaped form
So you
where
click
our
there, and
fossil
it'll give you a whole
gas
bunch
is
of numbers
used
to dial. So
directly
you dial all
in the
those on your
residential,
phone,
industrial,
and then
commercial, and power
it'll push the
generation.
sound through your phone.
And that power generation chart is bigger than
So
on
the
the
only other
previous
thing
chart
I
I
just want to warn
showed
you
you,
about, when you do it
because
that way,
it includes
in order to mute and unmute
independent
yourself
power generators that
using
don't
that, I think it's star
that sell
6 if you're trying to
electricity
talk to somebody.
outside of the state. So we have one very large natural gas power plant in Washington, but that doesn't serve Washington.
Give that a try and then give me a holler back
generally.
if you
So
need
that's
help.
why that number is a little bigger than the previous slide. So you wonder where our energy is used in the sectors. So this is consistent with what Eileen was showing, and this comes from their study. And in Washington, you can see that on whole, energy is used in the transportation sector primarily. And that's our biggest challenge. And the area where the Northwest Energy Coalition works that we're focused on today is in the electricity sector, and then this residential, commercial, industrial, which is the direct use of fossil gas primarily. So when I look at the utility sector, we've done a lot. We should feel, that we've covered a lot of ground in our state to reduce emissions. We've adopted a lot of policies that cover the emissions of independent power plants and them having to pay a fee. So we were one of the first states to adopt some kind of price on carbon. It's very low and doesn't really have an impact, but again, it was a tool that can be grown and now influences our decisions to put a price on carbon throughout our economy. We have adopted policies to expand renewable energy and energy efficiency. As folks know, just in 2019, we adopted the 100% clean electricity standard for our electricity sector. We have voluntary programs to purchase renewable energy. We have incentives for solar. We're trying to expand the amount of renewable gas that we use to replace the fossil gas. And the state just updated its greenhouse gas emission reduction goals and targets and set very specific timelines. And the energy strategy that Eileen talked about sets out that pathway across the economy. So much has been done in our state to set the groundwork for the next wave of policies that we will need to really meet those goals. And as Eileen kind of indicated, the landscape for our energy sector is changing rapidly. We are moving to decarbonize our buildings, decarbonize the grid, decarbonize our gas. And we have to look at the portfolio of things that need to be done in order to do that. Accelerating energy efficiency and managing our use is super important. One of the things that comes out of when I look at that Sinki chart that Eileen put up, one of the biggest issues is how much energy is wasted in our energy system. And so the tighter we get on managing our use and being more efficient, the less energy, the less cost we have as consumers, and then the less we have to produce on the production side, the less new projects we have to build, the less transmission we have to build. So focusing in on the demand side, the customer side, portfolio of resources, it's going to be really important. And we talk about the utility sector needing to change from providing you with electricity and with fossil gas. Really what I want them to do is provide you with energy services. And that might be helping you use less energy. That might be helping you put solar on your roof or help your small business manage your energy use more effectively. So one of the big trends is transportation electrification. And you're going to hear more about that later from my colleague, Annabelle Drayton. And electrifying transportation is great. And I want to know when you're charging. I want that managed so that it's helping support the electric system. The same with putting solar on your roof. How we manage our usage is going to be really important for the region. So this is our vision. This is the harmonious system where the customer side resources at the bottom on the right it's a two-way flow. It's integrated into the energy system, and customers are playing a critical role in meeting energy needs. It's not just one way from the power generators to your house or your business, but in fact, you're contributing to the energy system. And that will take more policies to get us to a place where we are ready to have a real two-way interactive energy system that is more community-based. So what is needed? Certainly a price on carbon would help. That's the market signal that we've needed. We need to provide individuals with customers to shift investments so that when they go to the store, they buy the low emitting resource, they buy energy efficient equipment and change their investment patterns. We want to prioritize community-based resources, and that means there's going to need to be policy and regulatory reform in order to support more of that two-way interaction between customers and the energy system. And then the last thing that we need is we have to help the fossil gas industry transition. And that we'll hear more about that in the building decarbonization conversation that Kate's going to talk about. But also on the utility side, the utilities have lots of infrastructure, lots of workers who are engaged in distributing gas. So thinking about hydrogen, thinking about renewable gas, thinking about how else we can repurpose the gas infrastructure so that it works for us, that it's seen as a tool and a resource and infrastructure that will be important for our system. So I'm going to close there, and I thank you. There's lots that we can do, lots of ways to engage, and we look forward to working with you in that. And thank you so much for your attention.
Great, thanks so much for being here, Nancy. And our final speaker for this first part, before we move into the Q&A, is Kate Simonin. Did I get that right, Kate? Hopefully so. Presenting on building decarbonization as an expert presenter. Kate's the executive director of the Carbon Leadership Forum and a professor and chair of the Department of Architecture at the University of Washington. Thanks so much for being here, Kate. Learning objective is to learn about the role of buildings and its contributions to statewide emissions and opportunities for decarbonization and climate mitigation. Turn it over to you, Kate.
Great, thank you, Gretchen, and hello, everybody, and welcome. I'm just thrilled to be here to talk about the building sector. We see that buildings are both an opportunity and a threat. Buildings consume a significant amount of energy and reduce carbon emissions, but building decarbonization can result in a lot of positive changes to climate, health, and equity. On the right here is another version of the pie chart of global emissions. So I think it's really interesting to recognize that there's different ways to slice the pie. Nancy was talking about, she put buildings in one section and electricity in another. In that pie chart, those building emissions were the direct emissions that happen at building. I'm looking at Nancy right now. Can you agree with me? That's like burning a natural gas boiler at a commercial office building, or in your own water heater, or cooking. And then there's the electricity impacts, and those electricity impacts also go to buildings. Some percentage of those go to buildings. And those are for lighting and heating as well, and cooling and all sorts of other things. So when we look at the building operations, there's a large impact of emissions from operating buildings and another impact from making buildings. And so I have this cartoon diagram here to show how we think about the life cycle of emissions from the building. So I'm an architect, and I'm thinking about what are the impact of buildings over their life cycle. And one part of the impact is from operating buildings. And so, as I said, that's lighting, heating, cooling, burning natural gas in a boiler. And then the other chunk of buildings impacts are coming from making the buildings and the building materials themselves, transporting those building materials across the world. And so we call those embodied emissions. But really, when we're looking at building decarbonization, we're looking to take the emissions out of that total impact from all the way from materials to operating. So there were some questions in the chat that were talking about, like, what's the impact of making the wind turbines, or what do you happen at the end of life? Those are the same types of thinking that we are looking at when we think of a building, all the way along the life cycle, trying to understand what are those trade-offs for the emissions from making something versus using it, and what happens at its end of life. So a total decarbonization is getting all of those together. There's a lot of great policy opportunities for decarbonizing buildings, and they generally fall into one of four different kind of buckets. One is around existing buildings, how to make them more energy efficient. New buildings, what do we do with the buildings we're building new as we grow? As was mentioned earlier, how do buildings interact with the electrical grid? And then how do we make choices about the materials that we're using? And there are strategies in each one of those areas that can be deployed and should be deployed. I do think it's really interesting that people's comment on this whole session is that it's overwhelming or maybe daunting or too much to learn or things like that. And I just wanted to note that it's not our responsibility to know everything of all the answers. It's our responsibility to identify what are the places that we can individually and collectively act, and how do we support larger scale action. So I'm not going to go into all of the different decarbonization strategies at the building sector. I'm going to do a little bit of a deep dive into my area of expertise, which is around building materials, and look at the opportunities of how we can drive innovation in the industrial sector by the choices we make at the building scale. So if we look at wanting to decarbonize building materials, there's a couple of key strategies. First one is to be smarter about how we design buildings, build less, so build a smaller building, reuse an existing building, or use less carbon intensive materials. So some of that can be, exploring in terms of building out of larger buildings out of wood is one strategy that's used. And there's also opportunities for picking manufacturers with cleaner energy sources and energy efficient manufacturing. The Nucor steel plant here in Seattle has the lowest carbon footprint steel almost globally. We are one of we're a green low carbon steel manufacturer. And then you can also use innovative materials that actually store carbon. So biogenic materials like trees, but also grasses and agricultural waste products are taking carbon out of the atmosphere. And if we can take those biogenic materials and store them in long life materials, that is a way of naturally sequestering carbon. There's a bill currently under consideration at the state of Washington called Buy Clean, Buy Fair. This is a policy often called Buy Clean policy. It's using state purchasing money. So when the state purchases materials to build universities or bridges or other infrastructures, they prioritize the purchase of materials that are a lower carbon impact to manufacture. So the current bill that's being considered in Washington State is primarily about requiring the manufacturers to declare the carbon footprint of their materials. So this is really the first step, labeling building materials so that we know the carbon impact of the materials that we are purchasing. And on the pie chart on the right, you can see that public procurement is a major purchasing power. So we, in all of the government purchasing, there's significant impact on the market. So if I'm going a little quicker to try and keep this to have time for some discussion. But I want to just make sure and highlight that there are key policy opportunities for building decarbonization. So as mentioned before, maximizing energy efficiency. So at a building scale, that could be incentives to add insulation in residential construction, change out the heating systems from an old inefficient boiler to a heat pump, double paned windows. And if we look at from an equity perspective, a lot of low-income housing and low-income individuals do not have the resources to invest in these energy efficiency upgrades. There are policies that do things like creating zero interest loans that get paid back, or that enable both low-income people to get energy efficient buildings, which reduce their costs and create lots of jobs. As mentioned before, maximizing electrification. So using new heating and cooking systems can translate away from fossil fuel combustion at the building site. You can optimize buildings as a grid resource. Often people plug their electric cars in at their house. Could the batteries in the cars help stabilize the grids? Is there a way that we can not charge our car at peak demand so we can be willing to wait until there's extra electricity available to charge the car in the middle of the night? Those are examples of building into grid integration. And then, as I was talking about, you can minimize the embodied carbon or the carbon emissions from the materials that we purchase and also from the refrigerants in air conditioners. And the decarbonizing the building sector results in good local jobs. These tend to be labor-intensive activities for local labor to add in insulation and change out systems. It results in cleaner air when we don't burn fossil fuels at our house. We have lower cost to operating buildings, and we have a global impact. I think I have one last slide, which I see I have time for. I just want to highlight on the right this diagram of the jobs created per $1 million of capital investment and spending by any measure. This is from the International Energy Agency. So the two down in the middle here around building efficiency retrofits, and efficient new buildings. Those investments have some of the highest return of number of jobs per dollar investment, and they have a long payback for the people that use and operate those buildings in the long term. I think I have some resources that will get posted on the web, both on total building decarbonization and on material strategies that people could access. So thank you.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Kate. I appreciate your presentation and thanks for being here. And with that, we are going to move right into the Q&A session. And we've got a lot of great questions, and feel free to keep them coming. We will be capturing all the questions throughout the course of the day. And if we don't get to any, just as a point of process as well, a reminder that we will be getting the responses from presenters and getting them posted up onto that shared folder as well. So the first question is from Angela from Vancouver, and this is for you, Eileen. What is the definition of clean electricity?
Right, so and Nancy addressed this a bit, but when we talk about clean electricity, we distinguish between renewable energy and non-emitting energy, with nuclear falling into the category of non-emitting. And as Nancy mentioned, there's a great deal of question and concern about other aspects of nuclear energy having to do with waste and cost and other issues around nuclear. So while it definitely does not emit carbon emissions, there are other considerations. But when people say clean electricity, they are usually including nuclear in that definition. But we generally, in our space, tend to distinguish between renewable energy and non-emitting. And there are all kinds of issues about what counts as completely clean, and you get into life cycle emissions and all kinds of other complexities. But that's at the highest level, how I would answer it. I don't know if, Nancy, you want to add anything else to that.
Great. Thanks, Eileen. The next question is also for you, Eileen, from Travis from Snohomish. What is rejected energy on that Sinki chart?
Thank you, chart. Yeah, and I apologize for not addressing that. So there's a significant amount of rejected energy in our energy system. This is true across all the country, the states. A good example of rejected energy would be waste heat from power plants. There's a huge percentage of rejected energy. The more the energy is rejected, the less efficient the system is. So there's also a lot of rejected energy, or energy that is lost along the way as energy is transmitted from source to use. So there's a great deal of waste in energy there. And frankly, this is also an argument for shifting from coal or natural gas to wind and to solar and to other renewable energy, because there's significantly less wasted energy in renewable energy. Nancy, I don't know if you would say anything else about rejected energy there beyond that.
Well, I think you covered it all. Even the heating and cooling systems at the top of buildings have a vent and for heat that has to escape, and that is lost energy. So we're even in our buildings trying to recapture that heat and cycle it back into the building so that we're not losing that heat. So it's all about
Right.
mostly
Trying to
about
close
heat.
the system.
Yeah.
Can I share a small scale example of that?
Sure.
There's air to air heat exchanger that you can have at a residential scale, so that instead of venting out all of your hot air, you warm up the air that comes in already. So you vent your hot air out that's polluted, and you bring in fresh air, but they mix each other and heat each other up. And there are passive house designs in which, with good insulation and these heat exchangers, you can run a house in Washington State without any added energy heat. You just heat yourself by walking around and doing things.
Great, thank you. And these next 3 questions are actually all for Nancy. So get ready, Nancy.
Can I ask one thing? I noticed that there was a question where I didn't really describe the difference between sequestered and utilized energy. Is that right? I saw that early on.
Yeah, so just point of process. So folks,
want me to write about that later?
Yeah, we just people are upvoting questions, and so we're bringing forward the questions first that got the most.
But
So.
You'll want me to write up and send you those to be posted? Okay, sure. I captured all of them in the chat, so I've written answers and I can send them to you later.
Great, thank you.
Okay.
Okay, so these next 3 are for Nancy, and actually they're all 3 on wind energy. The first is from Bethany from Warden. How much of wind-produced power is wasted due to lack of storage options?
Well, at the moment, only really during the spring I don't have a specific percentage for you when we have a lot of hydro generation, and we have what's called overgeneration with wind, because it also happens to be kind of a windy time of the year. And that's a period where our wind is producing and our hydro system is maxed out because we've got a lot of runoff, and that wind is wasted or overgenerated and doesn't really have a market. We do project in the future, as we build more renewables, we will need more storage. And there are lots of different kinds of storage that we will need, both battery storage, that's more locally in your home or in at businesses, or the utility scale storage. There's also compressed air storage, where you're using cavities in the earth to store compressed air during times when you have extra electricity. There's also pumping water and pumping things uphill and then letting it run down when you need the energy. So using that. And then the biggest storage opportunity is producing hydrogen, using our excess renewable energy to create, with electrolysis, to create hydrogen and then store that hydrogen for later use. So there's lots of opportunities, and it is really important for our future.
Thanks, Nancy. The next question is from Sue from Medical Lake. Why are we not using our own wind power rather than selling it?
Well, we have an interconnected grid. Our electricity system is connected to all the states around us and across the West. And the most efficient use of our electricity resources is to share them. It's sunny in the Southwest when it's dark here. So they overproduce electricity in the Southwest with their solar resources, and they sell that up to us. In the spring, when the heat in the Southwest and Southern California is on the rise, it's still very moderate here. So that's when our hydro system is really, with, as I said, with lots of runoff, is cranking. So we want to sell our electricity to the Southwest and to Southern California. So there's an exchange of resources all the time on the grid to maximize the use of our renewable energy and just the most efficient generators. We want them to work first. So those are the ones that are on the market.
Great, thank you. The next question is for Kate. This is from Sue from Medical Lake. Europe, to preserve history, will remodel rather than build new buildings. Does this help with carbon emissions, or is it a purely historical plus?
So reusing existing buildings has a co-benefit of supporting historic preservation and being a lower carbon solution. And in many, there can be some challenges with doing decarbonizing historic buildings in terms of maintaining character of windows and exterior walls and things like that. But there's significant amount of work that you can do that can still preserve the character of the building and increase energy efficiency, and it saves the need to rebuild something else. So they're both good.
Great. Okay, thanks. And the next question is also for you, Kate, from Chris from Linwood. I've seen building designs that allow the wind to swirl around the building, reducing its sail surface area. I see buildings like that harnessing that effect and generating electricity for the building. Let's see, also micro hydro strategies since rain has to flow down the building. Are those ideas under consideration for those taller buildings?
Yeah, so there are, pilot case studies of tall buildings trying out trying out wind generation. There's more exploratory research on some of the things like what you've talked about, how might you harness rain flow or something like that. That is not at an implementation scale. I think one of the things, we do see lots of solar on buildings, but we're also seeing an understanding of what's the relationship between the building and the grid, so that if we think about, one way to generate electricity in a building is to do all those things right on the building. And there are opportunities there, especially on large roofs of like big box stores and things like that, to have a direct payoff. And if we look at taller and bigger buildings, relationships to offsite renewable generation can be just as or more effective, because you're putting those resources at a place where there's scale that can happen. So there's a recognition that the buildings can both do it themselves, but that it's integrated into the grid, and supporting offsite generation can also be an equally effective way. I'm really intrigued by the micro hydro idea.
Great, excellent, thank you so much. And we have a few questions in here about cost and cost to the consumer. Could somebody speak to cost to the consumer?
Well, I'll jump in on the more efficient our system, the lower your bill. So one of the things we say in the the electricity space or the utility space is customers pay bills, they don't pay rates. So your rate for per kilowatt hour, per therm may go up, but if your home is more efficient, your bill goes down. And the new, so being more efficient, using your resources locally, as Eileen said, we lose energy in the loss of transmission. So the more we use locally, the cheaper it's going to be. Also, I would mention that a lot of the renewable energy, they don't have a fuel, right? The fuel is free. So they are lower cost than the fossil fuel system we're using now. Is there a cost to the transition? Kate mentioned it costs to retrofit buildings, right? We want to decarbonize our buildings, but who's going to pay for that retrofit? And those are serious questions that the policymakers and all of us in our collective thinking need to grapple with, and how we do that transition so that we don't increase the energy burden. And also, when retrofits are done, how do we make sure that the building owner doesn't increase the rent or increase so that we displace tenants from their building? So those are real questions we're grappling with.
Can I jump in a little bit? Because I think one of the really interesting challenges here is that those building scale retrofits, they pay back from a cost in carbon relatively quickly. However, they are still a little long for most low to moderate income homeowners. If you don't have the assets to put this in and wait 5 years for them to pay off, you just never get the opportunity to do that. So this is where programs that really support pretty much everybody. If you look at, it's difficult for everybody to invest a chunk of $10,000 into something, into their home. But that can pay off quickly. So that would be a really, and from my perspective, a really exciting place for policy, because we can look at the system and how the value of that decarbonization over the system pays off quickly. It's just about facilitating that work to happen. And it's jobs for people who are doing that work, and it's training them to be workers in that economy.
Great, thank you. Okay, a couple of additional questions about costs. This is from Jason from Seattle. How will measures to cut carbon emissions affect my life in terms of costs?
I'll go, because that's totally not my area of expertise. So I'm just going to tell you boldly as how I'm thinking about it. We have, I look at a life cycle. So our life is has costs across it. So think about what are my costs going to be over the arc of my life, and where will there be impacts? And we can see that there are future impacts coming, and we need to start paying attention to where those costs are going to play out over our lives and the lives of everybody in the state. So hopefully the policies can be done in such a way that enables just equitable transition. I'll hand it over to somebody else.
Well, I would just add that it is likely in the short term there would be costs. But as Kate says, we have to look at it over the arc. So thinking about electrification of transportation, right? There's the upfront cost of changing your vehicle, right, to an electric vehicle. But the fuel costs are much cheaper with electricity. And so on a life cycle basis, it's a lower cost solution. And the same is true for the transit system. They want to switch to electrified buses. And there's the upfront costs, which is significant. But then over the life of those transit buses, it's a lower cost option. So it's how you are, and that's where, as Kate says, the policy comes in. We have to share the upfront costs so that we bring the costs for everybody down.
Thank you. The next question is from Ledwell from Camino Island. Would reasonable tax credits be an incentive for industry and private homes to self-power?
I'm sorry, Gretchen, can you repeat the question?
Yeah.
I sure can. Would reasonable tax credits be an incentive for industry and private homes to self-power?
Yes. Yeah, I mean, putting a price on carbon, providing utility incentives for developing, again, energy services. So they should support self-generation. Because if you connect it to the grid, then they're sharing and the utility is able to utilize those resources to support the grid. So there's a reason for them to invest and to encourage homeowners and building owners and industry to self-generate.
And not punish them.
Great. Next question is from Corbin from Bellingham. What is the biggest source of energy wasted?
Well, I actually am not sure in Washington state. You may know, Nancy, what's the biggest source of energy wasted. There is enormous waste in what's, ventilated and transmitted. But in Washington state, I'm going to assume it's coming from power plants. But
yeah, I think it is likely power plant, fossil and coal-fired power plant generation.
That's generally where it is across the country.
Yep.
And then from my lens, I'd say it is leaky old buildings.
Right.
Great. Thank you all. The next question is from Barry from Bellevue. How long is natural gas expected to be viable for all of the uses we use today? And then follow-up question, what energy will replace it?
Well, that's an interesting question in terms of, Nancy, you definitely should
go
answer
ahead.
this
Go
too.
ahead.
But I mean, this question of what is the viability of natural gas, it's currently very inexpensive, and therefore it has been used to replace coal, and that has decreased emissions, but it still emits. And there's all kinds of different definitions of viability and use that you would hear depending on who's answering the question. If you are a utility that owns those assets and that makes a profit off of them and it's part of their business model, then they're going to want to have that asset exist as long as possible to get their return on their investment. And this is something I would have said earlier about the cost question too, in terms of not leaving those who can least afford it with gas as the gas prices go up, as people transition to electricity. So there's a lot of question about how you would evaluate how long natural gas should be in the system, and you have to look at it through a variety of different lenses. And I think, of course, first and foremost, the lens of emissions. Nancy, what would you say about this?
Yeah, I would add that, and you talked about alternatives. I guess I would start with the amount of energy transitioned, and I think the decarbonization studies show this. When you eliminate the natural gas use, and you put, if you for example put it all on the electric system, right now our electric system is not ready to handle all of that load. It's a significant increase in load, and we don't have the system ready for that. So there does need to be a transition period as we transition our buildings and our vehicles, because we have to get the electric system ready at the same time. But there are some uses that will need to continue to use gas, and that's where renewable gas and hydrogen come into play. And we need to figure out the best uses for those limited gas, clean gas resources. And when I say hydrogen, I'm talking not about fossil generated hydrogen, but renewable electrolysis generated hydrogen.
Yes, yeah, the decarbonization studies show that there is gas on the system in 2050, but it is used very rarely for what are described as, high impact events where suddenly you have a surge or a need due to a storm or a variety of different factors that could come together. Right. So there will likely, at least at this point, appear to be the need for gas on the system, but it is renewably generated at that point. And Kate has.
I just want to add that, there's innovations in heating and cooking at electrical scale. So at a residential scale, there's viable solutions today. But if we look at material manufacturing, like making steel or cement, it is where you need super high heats. So that would be another example where it is going to be a really interesting challenge to eliminate the use of fossil fuels to make materials.
Right, and so essentially we have a carbon budget in which we need to try to figure out how we're going to power our society. And so the question becomes, where can you move uses to lower carbon, and which lower carbon ones do you need? And then what do you have at the end that still requires some type of, at this point, fossil fuel generated energy?
And this is a question from Rich in Federal Way. And this is going back to kind of the question on the homeowner and kind of impacts of the homeowner, and recognizing that there are upfront costs and we're paying into the future. But do people get their money back, and do they get kind of the payoff from this initial higher cost investment?
There is lots of great research that shows sort of what are the first, which are the tiers of activities that you can get your fastest, best payoff. So it depends on location and exactly the type of house, but there are clear strategies that can be deployed. The challenge is it is really hard to know what those strategies are as an individual homeowner. And there's hard to find the installers and the financing and all of those sorts of things. And that's where policy and support structures can really help the many different homeowners, the low-income housing projects, and all of those sorts of things to identify the highest impact ways, the fastest payback. So yes, there are strategies that make a significant difference that pay back within the 10-year frame. And that's a time frame that policymakers, that makes sense from a policy perspective, but that's hard for an individual homeowner. I'm not sure if you're going to sell your home.
Right. Yeah. And one of the things that we're trying to influence, gets down to what is the your water heater breaks. What does the repair person have on their truck? Right? Do they have an inefficient, low-cost water heater, or do they have the most efficient? It might be slightly higher. And do they explain to the homeowner that this is the better option? for them, and rather than putting in the inefficient. And so trying to influence at even down to the retailer and the supply chain of the installers, so that they know what the best choices are, and that the homeowner has that option when they're making choices.
And I would add that the policy piece is really important, particularly when you talk about selling the house. If there's something called property assessed clean energy in place, or if there are other tools that we can have that mean that as you sell your house, which you have increased the value by doing these energy efficiency measures and all of the ways in which you've made your home more comfortable, you should be able to pass on to the next homeowner the costs of that, so that you don't, so that they continue to enjoy the benefits. And we need to think again, as Kate was saying, about this trajectory, the arc, a life cycle approach, a longer term approach. And in general, that's one of the challenges of what we're dealing with right now, is we need a long-term perspective. And we have to also think about the avoided emissions and the climate benefits and all the co-benefits that come from this. The healthier environment in the home, cleaner air. There's lots of other benefits that need to be considered and have value, be valued in the marketplace, which is where policy can help.
Thanks. This next question, do green energy projects affect the environment, such as fish, wildlife, and health? And how green can they be if there are environmental justice considerations to tribes or other rural communities dependent on those natural resources? How are treaty rights considered?
Nancy, do you want to start there?
Yeah, so there's our hydroelectric system has had huge impacts on tribal communities, on our fish and wildlife. And behind every dam, there's a giant lake. So a river has been turned into a lake, right? So that is a huge impact. And I would also say nothing is benign. And every resource we use has a cost, has an impact. And our challenge is to be smart about and intentional in looking at the cultural and environmental impacts of all of the new resources we develop, and looking at our existing resources and seeing which ones need to come down based upon their environmental and cultural impacts. So it is one, starting any new resources. Not every renewable energy project is a good project if it is in a location that does not make sense from an environmental, wildlife, or a cultural impacts perspective. So we have to be have a screen to assess where the best locations are for the resources that we need to develop.
And I think what I would add to that too is that screen needs to be developed by the communities themselves, and that the potentially impacted communities need to be not only at the table, certainly not just asked to listen, but they need to actually be empowered and have agency to make those decisions. That's true across all highly impacted communities, not just in our state, but all over. But it is particularly true in the Native communities. And it is long past due for us to have Native communities decide what their energy future should be, and be in that driver's seat.
Great, thank you all, and thank you to each of our presenters this morning. Really appreciate the Q&A and appreciate your presentations and being here with us today. And that concludes our Q&A portion for this first section of presentations. We are going to go right into break, and similar to how we've done the last couple of weeks, we are going to go into breaks as breakout rooms. Take the break if you need it, but it is just an opportunity to turn on your camera, to unmute yourself and talk to your fellow assembly members if you'd like to, but take care of yourself too. Thank you all so much. And with that, we will head straight into break.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Excellent. Welcome back, everybody, into the main room. It's great to see everybody's faces as I just kind of scroll across. I've got 4 pages of faces, which is really fun to see. And hopefully you all were able to grab a glass of water, cup of coffee, stand up a little bit, talk to some of your other assembly members if you chose to do that. Once I get the go-ahead from Wendy, we are going to move right into our next set of presentations for the morning. And we feel free to stand up, do a final stretch if you need to, grab your final glass of water, cup of coffee. Got mine right next to me. And Wendy, let me know when we're ready to get rolling here.
We're ready, Gretchen. Do you want me to share the presentation slide?
For Andrea Axel. So I'm just going to be introducing Andrea Axel.
Yeah.
Okay, great. So our first presenter for this afternoon, or I guess we're kind of straddling between morning and afternoon here, is Andrea Axel, who will be presenting on community energy planning. As an expert presenter, she is the executive director of Spark Northwest and leads their policy work to remove barriers and open doors for equitable deployment of renewable energy. Learning objective that she'll be covering here is about community energy planning, statewide policies that support and make them successful, as well as what opportunities the state can play to create more community energy resilience. Thanks so much for being here, Andrea.
Thank you. It's good to be here. I'm going to share my screen because I have a presentation. Let's see. Okay, is that working? Can someone give me a thumbs up if it seems like you're sharing my screen? Excellent, okay. Well, so my name is Andrea Axel and I work at Spark Northwest, and we're a nonprofit organization. And before I even get started, I just wanted to take my hat off to everybody on this call who is spending their time on a Saturday to listen and learn and share ideas. And this whole idea of a climate assembly with real live human beings really trying to figure out what makes most sense for policy for our state is just both exciting and inspiring, and I'm thrilled to be a part of your day. So thank you very much for inviting me. I'm gonna, let's see, here we go. Spark Northwest, we're pretty small. We're a 7-people organization and we operate both in Oregon and Washington. And we're really focused actually not always on policy. Mainly the thing that we do is we actually try to build community energy, clean energy projects. So we think of ourselves as we partner with communities to build equitable, affordable, clean energy. And we're really focusing on how a community could get the benefits of making the transition to clean energy that would not necessarily be first in line. So we really look a lot at communities with the fewest resources and think, how could we use this tool to both make the planet cleaner, but also build stronger economic communities. Today, I know I only have a few minutes, and so I thought I'd just give you a quick overview so you could see where I'm going to try to pace myself. I'm going to talk a little bit about the green divide as we see it, particularly for renewable energy and what that means. But then I'm going to spend most of my time giving you 3 real-life examples of some projects we worked on in the state, sort of like what went well, what went wrong, and then with sort of that idea of what policy might do to make a fix for that. So really focusing mostly on folks that are trying to kind of make this transition to clean energy and what gets in the way. And then I have a couple goals for future policy and 1 question I want you guys to keep asking. So that's what I'm hoping to get done in my 12 minutes. First, I think you've probably heard a lot about this, about the idea of a green divide, but I just wanted to talk for a minute or two, because when we're thinking about this transition, this is just sort of very much from Spark Northwest, how we think about it. I just thought I would give you that framework, as then you can see why we're working on the community projects that we are. So when we just sort of think of who is benefited and who is harmed from fossil fuels, the impacts of pollution are just really unequally felt, and very often communities with fewest resources, impacted by poverty, impacted by systemic racism, impacted by any number of sort of inequities, end up who feels the health effects of living in neighborhoods where the air or water is not clean, and then also at the same time, like who has really sort of benefited from the whole fossil fuel economy is generally more privileged folks. And so it's just really like kind of wrong that both the benefits and harms are sort of spread out really unevenly and unfairly. And so we really like to think, oh, great, we're moving to clean energy. The picture's so pretty, the hands, the sun, the everything. And yet, because a lot of these sort of systems of inequity have just sort of been baked in, unfortunately, to the fabric of almost everything, it's pretty easy to start replicating those same unfairnesses. And this is a chance to sort of structure things differently, think differently. And we sort of ask ourselves the question of like, what would you do if you could put first in line the folks with the fewest resources? And that's really, unfortunately, not how we're currently going about it. So I have one example, and then I'm going to turn more to the things that we're working on in the state. And the one example is in 2015, there was 6.8 million in state incentives to put solar on rooftops. And this is just the King County results. But of that 6.7 million in incentives were spent to put solar on single family homes. And so that generated $2.1 million in annual savings and all this new clean energy. But the median income for those households was $90,000. And that really is therefore not helping folks that are anywhere near the federal poverty guidelines or the lowest percentage of the area median income. And only 80,000 in incentives went to multifamily housing. So if I could redo this graphic, I would just have that little tiny 80,000 in such a small thing and the many, many, many homes that got solar. It's not that solar is bad. We don't say that at all, but we just need to think differently about where we're putting priorities when we're directing public funding. So this slide is just saying what we think the three key things are for a just transition to clean energy. And that's that it moved power and control of production into the hands of community, that it ensure a fair distribution of the benefits and the burdens of energy, and also that as we're designing these solutions, it centers the concerns of marginalized people. And I'm going to bring this up again at the end, because that's I think those are the kind of the key best things we could be thinking as we're designing policy. Okay, so here's our three case studies. One, this is the idea of putting solar on community land trusts, which are a vehicle for folks with pretty low incomes to have a path to home ownership. And we thought, well, let's try to start seeing if we could add solar to some of these homes. And we thought of some solutions that are sort of like that work for upper middle class, of getting some tax incentives and some discounts and then some loans that sort of work out. And when we went to folks, they were sort of like, no, thank you, no debt. You don't understand like the many, many things, very adverse to creating more debt no matter how long you're going to pay it off. And we realized we have to go back and think of a different model. And so when working with these homeowners, we raised extra money just to get the full cost of the panels covered. And then the other thing that we kind of learned as we went along was when we did this in Washington, we were able to get, and say it's 10 homes. When we went and did this in Oregon, kind of replicating this model, we were able to get almost triple the number of homes. And the reason is just that so many more subsidies are available in Oregon. And so it's just that thing of like when we put some public funds towards this, and there's a bunch of different like things that you can stack, especially if you're having the incentives for folks with really low incomes. And so it is sort of that real life example. So the two lessons learned from this is a real family that really had those particular panels installed. And the lessons learned from this project is when we're thinking of solutions, I think if we want to impact and help folks with low wealth, let's not have solutions that involve them taking on more debt, because if you listen to them, that's not what they want. And the other thing is that more public funding and subsidies equals more projects, which is a no-brainer, but like that's a very real thing. When we did it in one state with the exact same model, and the other state, we just got a lot more done. Okay, I'm going to move to another real life example. This, I'm sorry, the picture's blurry. It is just my technical incompetence of cutting and pasting, but these are congregation members of the Shiloh Baptist Church in Tacoma. And this is a kind of anchor in the community. They, obviously are a faith-based community and they have all kinds of resources. This is a great place to sort of come together. One of those kind of like stronger together, all kinds of other activities happen in this church, and they wanted to think about exploring how renewable energy could work and, sort of make their this anchor institution stronger. And we worked with them over quite a period of time. There's a lot of learning, a lot of technical stuff with renewable energy. And they put in an application to get a grant. And they got turned away the first time. And it was really disheartening and dispiriting. And it ended up sort of being that they had ratepayers vote on this project. And there was another one was a public school that had a lot more sort of folks that could weigh in. And we ended up sort of like re-encouraging, and they went back the second year. And just recently, we're very, very pleased to say they got a grant to cover the whole cost of putting solar here. And then they'll get the cost savings. They can maybe, there's renewable energy credits, there's reducing the energy burden of this organization, which will free up resources for them to do other work with one another. And when we think about this, though, the couple lessons learned is, I think really if we're offering public grants or public funding, we want to be super clear about who is the priority and why, and make it so that you don't end up having to put enormous resources in to apply and then have it not be fairly clear if you qualify or not. And also just factor in that all of that pre-planning takes an enormous amount of resources. So when we're thinking about this, of just that intense persistence to even get in the door, a lot of work to qualify to sort of like be considered even for a public grant, and that could be a burden that's just insurmountable for a lot of folks. And also, I think public resources, if we can target them to really focus on the communities we think could use that have the highest benefit, that will just reduce number of effort that then doesn't end up resulting in an actual project. And this third one, this is a group up in Whatcom County, community to community, pretty awesome. It's a cooperatively owned farm. A bunch of folks that work in agriculture industry come together to sort of create their own farm where they get to control a bunch of things. And they're really interested in having a community solar project where they can do ground mounted and share the benefits of it. This is another one. It's taken a couple years for them to sort of figure out the plans. And I mentioned this one in part because it's another great success story. We managed to patch together 3 different things. Our nonprofit gave them some funding to help just that capacity building planning. And then they were able to get both a federal grant, a rural grant, and a utility grant. And so they're going to be able to do this project. And one of the things I think is important about having communities design for themselves and be able to spend that time and energy to figure out what their goals are is it could be really different. And when a project is designed by and for the community itself, it could be different than if it's designed by and for folks with privilege. And in this case, workforce development is a really key thing, because you may want to control your own energy generation, you may want to be more green on the planet, you may want to get the economic benefits, you may want to figure out exactly where it should be located according to your own needs. But you may also really want to keep money local, generate more jobs, generate sort of a next generation of folks involved with clean energy. And that was important to these folks, and that ended up being one of the things that got included in their proposal is a whole workforce development. So lessons learned from this is that when we're doing public funding, we should not just think what's shovel ready, because then you start prioritizing folks that have great infrastructure, that already can do a technical study, that can have a marketing department and can get everything all lined up. And a lot of matching fund requirements end up just very much preferencing folks that already have a lot of support. So we would sort of really say for target populations, if you could waive a lot of those things, just think differently and have more funding to sort of be able to get something so that it is shovel ready. And then also just the idea of, as you're thinking about, it's not just the project. Very often for a community with fewer resources, the continuation of getting more folks that might want to transfer out of agriculture into clean energy is important. Let me see on my time. I think we're still, oh good, I have 2 minutes left, so I can tell you my policy guidelines. For us, I'm coming back to that slide about clean energy policy goals. So we think a lot about how the 3 things that I was just talking about, some in those examples, But how do you move power and control of production into the hands of the community? How do you ensure a fair distribution of benefits and burdens? And how do you center the concerns of marginalized people? And if you take nothing else away, the one question I would want you to think about when you're thinking of any policy solution, I think this is very true for clean energy, but anything else that you're coming up with and designing, this is the one question that we wrestle with all the time that I would really encourage everybody there, which is to ask, does this policy shift power and wealth to marginalized communities? And no matter what you're looking at, if you can answer yes, I say go forth and, excellent. And if the answer is no, if you feel like no, it's sort of a more equally spread out across everybody, I would really ask you to challenge yourselves to think, how could you change it? Is there something you can do that really does either, carve out part or really center concerns of marginalized communities in whatever solution you're designing? And so it might be different, treatment, but that's really because they may be at a different starting place. So that would be the task. And I don't think it's easy because most policies don't shift power and wealth to marginalized communities. Most suggestions don't. So it's hard. And I think this group of amazing human beings that are willing to spend their Saturdays learning and thinking about this stuff could think of some design solutions that do. So that would be the biggest thing I would say, no matter what you're doing, is if you can think along those lines. It's new, it's novel, and I think it's the challenge of our time. And I think we could really come up with some solutions that do. And the last slide that I had is just some resources. And I think you guys will have these decks. And these are 3 things that we use for guidance about how environmental health disparities are different in our state. That's an interactive map you could look at. The Powering the Transition is a report from communities of color saying what's most important in the energy transition from the perspective of their communities. And the other one is it's a nationwide organization, but it's looking at what does energy justice look like. And that's the end of my show.
Thank you so much, Andrea. I appreciate you being here today. And we're going to move straight into our next presenter, Annabelle Drayton, presenting on transportation and the energy sector as an expert presenter. She's a policy associate at Northwest Energy Coalition and advocates for affordable and equitable transportation, electrification, and carbon policy in the Northwest. So the learning objective here, role of the transportation sector and its contributions to statewide emissions and opportunities to decrease emissions in the transportation sector. Thanks for being here, Annabelle.
Hey everyone, are you able to see my presentation?
Yep, you're all set.
Great, thank you. So, hi everyone. I appreciate you taking the time to be here today. My name is Annabelle Drayton, and I'm a policy associate with the Northwest Energy Coalition. And Nancy Hirsch, the Northwest Energy Coalition's executive director, provided a great overview of our work in the energy sector. But my work at the Northwest Energy Coalition really focuses on the intersection of the transportation and the energy sector, focusing on solutions to efficiently, affordably, and equitably optimize the use of electricity as a transportation fuel. And this is the lens in which I will address the topic of reducing emissions in the transportation sector today. So, what is the transportation sector? The means and methods of moving people and goods. And we use different methods of transportation to get to work, and school, visit friends and family, access emergency and non-emergency medical care, and travel, and so much more. And the means of moving people and goods can include walking, biking, taking the bus or ferry, driving a car, taking an airplane or train, and more. And we all have different lived experiences with the transportation sector, but it's generally a significant part of our lives. For example, the average household in the US spends almost 20% of its total income on transportation expenses. This is often higher for low to moderate income households and rural drivers who rely on driving to get to essential services like healthcare and so much more. Overall, it's a significant part of our lives, and solutions to reduce emissions and air pollution need to also be accessible, affordable, reliable, safe, and equitable to truly work for everyone. We've had the privilege of seeing this chart a few times today, and I'm not going to dive deep into it, but the takeaway here is the dark blue section of the bar represents the transportation sector. And the transportation sector makes up over 40% of Washington's greenhouse gas emissions. And this is even higher sometimes in certain cities, like Seattle's over 60% transportation emissions. And the same vehicles that emit greenhouse gases also contribute to air pollution like particulate matter, nitrogen oxides, and sulfur dioxide. And these pollutants can weaken our body and lung defenses and leave us at higher risk of asthma and other diseases. And we know that communities experiencing lower incomes and Black, Indigenous, and people of color have been disproportionately exposed to this pollution and correlated economic burdens. And I did see some questions in the chat about how and why this is the case. And there's a lot of historic policies that have culminated in this, but we know right now, one thing that we know is when we look at the data, we overlay where these communities live with where the higher amounts of air pollution and emissions are, like along highway corridors, we know they overlap. And so all the data also points us in this direction, and the lived experiences point us in this direction. So we've gone over the problem, but what are some of the solutions? So pathways to reduce transportation sector emissions. So there's really two high-level pathways that we often think about, and it's moving people and goods more efficiently and equitably. The first one is really like reducing vehicle miles traveled and moving people and goods more efficiently. And the second one is electrifying vehicles and switching to more efficient and lower carbon fuels. And I'm going to be walking through the second pathway. So what's currently in place? We're not starting at ground zero. We have some strategies in Washington already. So right now, electric utilities invest in transportation electrification. And transportation electrification refers to the use of electricity to power different means of transportation, like vehicles, ferries, and bikes. And electric utilities play an essential role in transportation electrification, both in reliably and affordably serving the needs of a growing customer base and in strategically planning to ensure transportation electrification results in benefits to all of their customers. Electric utilities are already able to invest in transportation electrification. Energy and electricity is a necessity, and utilities have an obligation to serve all of their customers. If they engage proactively in supporting the electrification of transportation to this new customer base, they can actually help to reduce costs and increase equitable access and make sure lots of different customers' needs are met. They're already doing some of this work, but they can significantly increase it as well. So zero emission vehicle standards. Washington has the authority to adopt standards that require automakers to increasingly sell light duty zero emission vehicles. So light duty vehicles are the vehicles that many people drive every day. There are sedans, SUVs, and many pickup trucks. And zero emission vehicles are all types of vehicles that have zero tailpipe emissions and are powered by electricity or hydrogen as a fuel. Right now, while these technologies exist, it can actually be hard to find or purchase or lease a zero emission vehicle in Washington. And Washington will soon formally adopt this standard that requires automakers to increasingly sell zero emission vehicles so consumers have access to them when they want them. I think the percentage starts off small, about 3% of new sales, and increases gradually each year. So we also have tax credits and exemptions for alternative fuel vehicles in place. So if there's a commercial vehicle tax credit, so for natural gas, propane, hydrogen, or electricity vehicles, and a tax exemption for light duty alternative fuel vehicles. If your business purchases or leases an alternative fuel vehicle, it can claim the tax credit. And if you personally purchase or lease an alternative fuel vehicle, you won't have to pay up to $2,500 of the sales tax that you would have to pay otherwise. This starts to bring down the upfront costs closer to traditional technology, like vehicles that run on gasoline or diesel. We have an EV-ready building standard. So Washington has a requirement that new buildings be built EV-ready with 10% of accessible parking spaces equipped with chargers. It's really expensive to upgrade the electrical panel, wiring, and conduit, so installing it when building can really reduce the long-term costs and allow communities to access electric vehicle charging more easily. I will add that the standards could be upgraded to go farther to meet the growing needs. And the last one I wanted to touch on was state grant programs. Grant programs to support the transition is important. And Washington has some grant programs like the Volkswagen Enforcement Action Grant, and the Clean Energy Funds. These help develop and deploy new technologies to meet state emission reduction goals. So what is needed? Really, these strategies that I'm going to walk through quickly, hopefully, have demonstrated real and meaningful emissions reductions, and they can make the transition more economically viable and accessible in Washington. So the Clean Fuel Standard is designed to reduce the average life cycle carbon intensity of transportation fuels. I'm not going to go into the details because the next presenter is focusing on this, but I will note under our program, one of the benefits is that utilities generate revenue that can be reinvested with significant benefits and very minimized burdens to electric utility customers and residents in Washington. This could be millions of dollars every year. The legislation is needed to adopt this standard. So an advanced clean truck rule and medium heavy duty vehicle incentives, very jargony, and I apologize for that. This is a policy that would allow Washington to adopt similar zero emission vehicle standards for medium and heavy duty vehicles as we will soon have for light duty vehicles that I discussed on my last slide. So medium and heavy duty vehicles are some delivery vans, heavy pickup trucks, transit buses, box trucks, and long haul trucks. This would make these vehicles in Washington be more accessible by requiring automakers to increasingly sell them in Washington. I will note that it's important to have complementary incentives to make the cost more comparable to traditional vehicles as the technology evolves. And we don't need legislation to adopt this standard. Accessible public charging. So many people can and will charge their vehicles at home, but I got my time update. Many people can and will charge their vehicles at home, but public charging is still needed for people who don't have access to charging at home, like people living in apartment buildings, renters, low and moderate income households, many people who drive long distances. So right now, when you go to a gas station, you know how much you're going to pay, how you're going to pay, and that you're getting what you're paying for, but that's not always the case with electric vehicle charging. And so there are some standards that we could put in place in Washington that make public charging more accessible and protect consumers. I'll also note that education and outreach is very important so that people have the information they need to make choices. For example, if you want to purchase a new car, but you're not familiar with the cost savings that there could be for EVs, you might not choose that option when it could be a good option for you. So states and local government, consumer education groups and utilities can do a lot more in this space to increase outreach and education. And the last one is transportation decarbonization programs. And so really reducing or removing carbon emissions from transportation from further investment. One way to do this is to generate revenue from carbon pricing and then use a significant portion of that revenue to reinvest in reducing transportation sector emissions. So a lot of options, but also a lot of opportunities to reduce transportation sector emissions. I appreciate you all being here today. And I think we may have time for some questions now or maybe during the Q&A session after.
Yeah, thank you so much, Annabelle. And we're moving all the Q&A into a document, and then we'll be using the Q&A, the questions that are in the chat right now for that Q&A when we hear from all the speakers. Thank you so much. And with that, we are going to move right into our next set of speakers. I'd like to welcome both Representative Joe Fitzgibbon as well as Allie Lee, who will be presenting on the clean fuel standards as interested parties. And Representative Fitzgibbon, a special welcome to you as one of the original members who published the op-ed this summer calling for this assembly. And Representative Fitzgibbon was elected to represent Washington's 34th district in 2010 and chairs the House Environment and Energy Committee. And Allie is the co-chair of the Climate Reality Project. So the learning objective here is to learn about the clean fuel standards and how it can support greenhouse gas emissions and climate mitigation. Welcome to you both, and thanks so much for being here.
Thank you.
Thank you. I will go ahead and thank you so much for everybody who's taking the time to spend this many hours learning about and discussing the strengths and weaknesses of various climate policies. I'm excited to be here with Ali to, I'm just going to speak briefly and then turn it over to Ali to talk in more detail about low carbon fuel standard. But I have sponsored a bill to implement a low carbon fuel standard in the Washington State Legislature the last 4 years. In 2019 and in 2020, we passed that bill out of the House of Representatives. It didn't make it out of the Senate. But so far this year and the 2021 legislative session made really good progress. And I think this is maybe the year that we finally pass this bill into law. We have a lot of momentum. So what does this policy do? The low carbon fuel standard is this. Oregon and British Columbia. We are a jurisdiction on the West Coast that doesn't have a low carbon fuel standard in place. You also may hear the term clean fuel standard used interchangeably to describe it. It requires that the producers of transportation fuels, which is largely gasoline and diesel, so we're largely talking about oil refineries here, gradually.
And unfortunately, Representative Fitzgibbon, you keep cutting in and out. So maybe if you want to turn off your video and we can see if that helps. On the
why don't I try calling in? Why don't I turn it over
Okay.
to Ali while I call in?
Okay, sorry about that.
I actually have a video presentation of it, so we'll hang on here for just a minute while Representative Fitzgibbons. I wanted to thank Representative Fitzgibbons for sure for being such a champion, not only for clean fuels, but our communities as well. So I really appreciate you being here this time.
And let us know, Representative Fitzgibbons, do you have the number that you need?
I do, yeah, just
Okay, great, no worries. We'll just pause. I'm sure everybody appreciates the pause in this anyway. Folks can stand up, take a really short impromptu break here and just let us know, Representative, when you're ready to get rolling again.
Okay, can you hear me now?
We can.
Okay, you want me to hang on so folks can take a quick pause or jump back in?
Let's go ahead and jump back in.
Okay. So what I was saying, I don't know how much of it y'all heard, but a low carbon fuel standard or a clean fuel standard, you may hear those terms used interchangeably, is a policy that Oregon, California, and British Columbia already have in place. And it's a policy that requires the producers of transportation fuels, particularly the oil refineries that are producing gasoline and diesel for our on-road use, to gradually reduce the greenhouse gas output of those fuels over time. And they can do that in really one of two ways. One is that they can just produce different kinds of fuels, increase the amount of biodiesel, renewable diesel, ethanol that they're producing and mix that into the fuel that they're already selling. Or they can acquire a credit on a market from a producer of somebody else who's producing that clean fuel. So for example, Shell Oil with their refinery up in Anacortes area could choose, rather than producing their own biofuels, they could choose to buy a credit accounting for that same biofuel from the Renewable Energy Group, which is a company that operates a biodiesel refinery out in Hoquiam. So it doesn't pick a specific technology. It doesn't say we have to move towards electricity, we have to move towards biofuels, we have to move towards renewable natural gas. It just says that find the best way to reduce greenhouse gas output of transportation fuels over time. And it phases in over time. The bill that I have introduced calls for a 10% reduction in CO2 emissions from fuel by 2028 and a 20% reduction by 2035. So, you know, this is, sometimes this sounds to people like it's not ambitious enough. Sometimes it sounds to people like it's too ambitious. I will say transportation is a harder sector to decarbonize than some of the other sectors that produce emissions in our economy, like electricity. Because while wind and solar for renewable energy, electricity production have been, are really mature and are cost competitive, in most cases cheaper than fossil fuel generation for electricity. We haven't had the same level of policy support from state government for transportation fuels, and that's what this policy is intended to provide. I see it as primarily as a strategy towards reducing greenhouse gases, but it does have other benefits too, which I'll just highlight before I turn it over to Ali. One is that it creates new markets for rural economies in Washington for things that are produced on farms and forests. For example, dairy farms produce a lot of cow manure, which can be captured and put into an anaerobic digester and converted into renewable natural gas, which we can use for transportation fuel. Canola, which is a major farm product in some parts of eastern Washington and the Moses Lake area in particular, they grow a lot of canola. Canola oil is a great feedstock to produce biofuels because it's very energy dense. Waste products from forestry. There are parts of trees that, when they're cut down, there's not really a market for. We can convert those remaining products into cellulosic ethanol, which is a very low carbon fuel and is very heavily incentivized for this program. So new markets for rural economies, new economic development incentives for some of the parts of our state that most need those new jobs and that the ability to produce our own energy in rural Washington rather than import all of our energy from North Dakota and Alberta and Alaska, where we get all of our oil from today. And then the other upside is that while the main purpose is to reduce the CO2 emissions and stop contributing so much to climate change, these alternative fuels also produce less of the other kinds of pollution that harm our health, whether that's benzene, which is a carcinogen, carbon monoxide, which is emitted in much lower levels from biofuels than from gas and diesel. Carbon monoxide is a huge contributor to both infant mortality and maternal mortality. Electricity, of course, as you've heard from Annabelle and others, has no emissions from the tailpipe of the car. So enormous reduction, and this policy incentivizes electricity as well. In fact, in California, their low carbon fuel standard means that every electric car owner in the state is getting an $850 rebate just because of the clean fuel credits that are used to support electrification of transportation. And that's just this year. That'll only increase over time. So for those communities that are nearest to highways and are most exposed to pollution from highways, the people who live near highways have historically received most of that pollution and have been experiencing more of the respiratory harms and that harms our health than communities further away from those highways. And as we transition away from gasoline and diesel, we'll see improvements in health in those most polluted parts of our state as well. So that's the high-level version of why I'm excited about this policy and excited about our chances of success. And with that, I will turn it over to Allie.
Thank you so much again, Representative Fitzgibbons, for joining us today on a Saturday. And we look forward to further conversations. I'm just going to pull up my PowerPoint now for you. Sorry, just a second. There we go. Can everybody see?
Yes.
Okay, great. And I'll kind of run through some of these points in the very beginning. I just wanted to say this is a quick overview of the Clean Fuel Standard, which is HB 1091, that's in session this year. And hold on just a minute. There we go. The policy is about transforming and decarbonizing the transportation sector. To be clear, this policy alone isn't going to do that. It'll take many policies to begin to address the climate crisis, but this should be the kickoff of a positive investment cycle. I'm Allie Lee. I'm the co-field person for the Clean Fuels bill right now, along with Ben Jones from Climate Solutions. And I'm also the lead for the statewide Climate Reality Project Coalition. So I wanted to thank you all for having us here today. I'll jump into how it works. How it works is it requires a decrease in carbon intensity of fuels over time. The bill requires a decrease in carbon intensity of 20% by 2035, and as Representative Fitzgibbons said, 10% by 2028. It requires the Department of Ecology to set further guidelines to decrease the carbon intensity by 2050. And how it works is exactly how I said, is that it would require oil companies that are going to be generating carbon fuels that pollute the air to then help with carbon credits for those who are then producing clean fuels. So instead of generating bad fuels, it will then be cleaner fuels. The intensity of their product. For example, blending biofuels is a liquid fuel, and the credits for the clean producers would then move forward like electricity producers would say. Essential polluters can either find a way to pollute less, or they can directly finance renewable energy production, kicking off a positive reinvestment cycle. We're going to look at it this way as part of the cycle. The emphasis of HB 1091, the Clean Fuel Standard, is a strong electrification policy. A lot of people, when they think of clean fuels, you mostly think about liquid fuels, like biofuels. Definitely, they have a role. If you look at the blue section, that's ethanol. But if you look at the yellow chunk section in here, it's electric vehicles and electrified transportation. And that's the fuel that we expect to grow the most and to comply with the Clean Fuel Standard. So that's why we mean electrification of transportation is what we will see coming in this policy. Another example of electrification of transportation is a world fact, which we're a part of, is that the EU and Stockholm report predicts that the world will be at 90% electric vehicles by 2030. Something to consider. So let's look locally, what clean fuels means. The policy works by either getting dirty fuel producers to clean up their act, or they can pay clean fuel producers. They can make their fuel life cycle cleaner, more efficient, or pay clean fuel producers. So what this means is not just from the beginning, but it's the full cycle, from the well to the wheel, and then also the full cycle as far as all the way through the full carbon emissions. What it means here is such as, let's look at electric buses. Electric buses then would then help clean the air. In California, what it did for public transportation. The standard would then help, what the standard did is it helped then electrify buses that were then already used, and they just regenerated them again. Sorry about this. Regenerated them again. And on the average, buses that were new were then not needed to be purchased, but they just then took the old buses, made them electric buses, and this brought in $10,000 annually in clean energy credits. So this policy will help public transit agencies and their fleets remaining clean energy credits. Can you imagine your children going to school in a clean energy bus as opposed to one that's run off of gas now? What does it mean to our communities? Air pollution harms a lot of people, according to the Puget Sound Clean Air Agency. The pollution kills 1,100 Washingtonians annually. This map shows the racial inequities within that. This is the Washington Health Disparities Map. The transportation sector causes health-harming pollutions, in addition to GHG pollution, and this pollution is not evenly felt. Due to the racist practice such as redlining, communities of color are mostly affected. They have higher rates of then asthma in their communities, and also the death rate is found to be 13 years earlier than in other communities. One of the areas that's the most hit is the Duwamish area. In the lower life expectancy, and again, as I'd said, 13 years. Within the system also shows the COVID effect. In these areas where people have more of an immune system sort of that's compromised, it's showing that they have higher rates of COVID as well. And the pollution makes it more susceptible for them. So the Clean Fuel Standard will also benefit local economies in spurring growth in green jobs, in keeping cleaner fuels here at home, and by offering people more options of lower cost transportation. Right now we send money, $9 billion yearly out of state to oil companies for buying gasoline. This can change. Locally produced electricity and clean fuel producers will benefit under the Clean Fuel Standard, increasing jobs in these sectors. We already have close to 2,000 people in Washington state working in clean fuels and 3,000 in the EV industry. This will create a positive cycle of local circular economy, since it will add a revenue stream for us. For example, in the International District right now, they then collect the oil that then is picked up and then sent forward to the biofuel companies to be reproduced. Unfortunately, because of the fact that a lot of it was sent out of state, and we're hoping that this cycle will change, it no longer services the Washington State ferries, but we hope to have that cycle replaced again and brought back to the cycle of restaurants, then to biofuel collections, made into biofuels, and then servicing our local community. Because oil companies have a near monopoly on transportation fuels, they are able to charge prices with extremely high profit margins. They're almost at 80 cents per gallon here in the city, in Seattle. So what does this look like now? Washington wants clean fuels. We've said that because the fact that the polls have told us. This is a Elway poll that was then pulled from this year. And as you can see, almost 2 to 1, people want this policy. That the two.
We have about, sorry, Allie, we have about 1 minute left.
Okay, great, thanks. It shows across the state, the demographics, that it's not just a certain area that is looking at clean fuels, but it's across all demographics. It includes swing districts, urban and rural areas. Washingtonians do want clean fuels. The political landscape, real quickly, has passed the House and first the Senate committee twice, as Representative Fitzgibbon had said. Now it's a priority of the Democratic caucus in both chambers and also the governor. This is the year. This is the year that we can do it. It's supported from environmentalists, public health, parts of labor businesses, utilities, communities, and more. Our coalition has grown even stronger. I believe we will want clean air and clean fuels now and for the future generations. I want to thank you for your time.
Great, thank you so much, Representative Fitzgibbon and Allie. And if you both could stay for the Q&A, there are lots of questions that have been coming in that we'll bring forward during the Q&A panel. And with that, our final speaker for this session, Pedro Valverde, presenting on local action in renewable energy as an interested party presenter. Pedro is a retired professional electrical power and renewable energy engineer and has worked on decarbonization projects both here in the US and Peru. So learning objective is to learn about local perspectives on renewable energy. And with that, Pedro, I will turn it over to you. Thanks for being here.
Hello. Good afternoon. Good
and we're
afternoon.
going to spotlight you in just a second and take the spotlight off of me if we can go ahead and do that.
Okay, good afternoon. There's a slide showing who I am, and I belong, or I'm a volunteer with the Kitsap Environmental Coalition, which is based in the land of Suquamish Nation in Paulsboro, Washington. Next, please. Well, this looks like a long agenda, but I have maybe 3 or 4 pictures in there, which, you know, it's gonna shorten the agenda pretty much. And my topic is really about using renewable energies for decarbonization in the state of Washington. So I'll talk about utility solar and wind power technologies, residential, commercial, and industrial technologies, a little bit about existing legislation, policies, regulation. I will mention electrical energy prices using renewable energies. I'll try to explain the new terminology that's in the literature, you know, all over the place now. It's DERs and prosumers. DERs are distributed energy generation, which is another name for renewable technologies either. I'll show you existing and new proposed renewable energy plants in the Pacific Northwest. And I'll show you what the Northwest Power Council is doing so that we'll have clean energy in 4 states. So it's Washington, Idaho, Montana, and Oregon. I'll talk a little bit about renewable energy jobs and some of the Washington state policies action that have not yet been considered. And I'll make a recommendation. And then I'll open it up for questions and answers. Next, please. Okay, well, decarbonization in Washington using renewable energies, they are an alternative to the traditional energy that relies on fossil fuels. And the reason we're starting to using them is because they're a lot less harmful to the environment. And a listing of all these renewable energies are given in this slide. I'm not going to read all of them, but primarily solar power, photovoltaic, concentrated solar power, and wind power. In later additional slides, I'll talk about the other ones that you can see in this slide. Next, please. Pictures, you've probably seen some of this, all over the place now. Photovoltaic solar panels, they can be mounted on the ground or on rooftop residential, commercial, industrial buildings. Wind turbines, we have wind farms, several now in Washington. Next, please. In the rooftops, the major installation is something called grid-tied solar installation. Grid-tied means that it's an installation that is connected to the power grid. And the major connection is called net metering. It has two meters, one for the production of electricity with solar, and the other one is tied up to the power company or the electrical utility. Small wind turbines are also being used, and I'll talk about that in next slides. Here I have a lot of the existing legislation, policies, regulation. I have references to all of them because there's a lot to learn from those references. And then I have to mention a couple of buzzwords that are making people a little confused. We're talking about 100% clean energy nowadays. And I think I need to explain that as far as electricity by itself is a clean product. What's electricity are electrons that run in cables, and they're produced by a generator. And it's the generator you know, the driver of the generator, it's called the turbine, that really needs to be cleaned out, because that turbine is run by fossil fuel. So when we talk about clean energy, we're saying that, you know, we have to clean up all the machines that run the generators. And then we're talking about zero greenhouse gases, also known as CO2, that it's supposed to be happening by the year 2050. I don't think it's possible to do that. So we better come up to the idea that it might not eventually go to, you know, we get to zero greenhouse gases, because surprisingly, even humans, you know, emit CO2. So we might get rid of all the CO2 emissions from machinery, you know, transportation and everything that, you know, that we think it emits greenhouse gases, but we're not going to be able to get rid of CO2 that it's emitted by people.
And Pedro, 1 minute until we move to the Q&A.
Okay. Next, please. Here are some of the prices that electricity prices that we can get using renewables. And that is the reason why we're going to start using renewables, because these prices are lower than the prices that we get from using fossil fuels. Next, please. Distributed energy resources and prosumers. As I said before, that there's a new wordings for, you know, renewable energies, especially solar and wind. And it's just nothing like you install, you know, large capacity solar plants or wind farms, and they're just calling them distributed energy resources. There's problems with generating electricity in wind, because it's not a steady source of energy. Wind and solar have variability. They're not constant. However, in solar, if we add a battery, it is possible to have a generator that works 24/7.
And Pedro, we're at time here. So final concluding thought?
Concluding thought will be, keep going. Next. Right there. Here, this is what the Northwest Power organization is suggesting. You know, all of the things that have a marker are the technologies that are going to be used in the next 5 years. And in the majority are really technologies that are going to use gas, natural gas, because by using gas, we reduce the use of fossil fuels, especially carbon, and that will reduce the emissions for the state of Washington and also Idaho, Montana, and Oregon. However, I'd like to point out here that in the column that says emerging long term, they're mentioning sequestration as a solution for reducing. And I'd like to recommend that we have a natural resource that can do sequestration in large quantities of carbon, and that is a natural forest. If we use our national forests to combat climate change, we'll probably help, the Washington state.
Great. Thank you so much, Pedro. Appreciate sharing your thoughts here. And we are going to move straight into the Q&A. The first one is a question for Annabelle from Claudia from Ellensburg. If transportation is our greatest challenge, wouldn't it make sense to raise the driving age to get more cars off the highways?
To raise the driving age?
Yes.
I would say that's a really good question, and I'm not the person who's able to answer that, unfortunately. I'm sorry.
Okay, no problem. We will keep on moving and we'll get a response to that question. The next question is from Rich from Federal Way. How is it possible that the air and water is worse in low-income neighborhoods? And then there's a reference to the Washington Environmental Health Disparities Map and a question about if you can just elaborate on that.
Yeah, I mean, it's a really good question, and it's one that I'm continually learning about and working to understand the lived experiences of other people. And I think it's something that some of the presentations touched on. And really that health disparity map is an example of where, Washington has taken data of, where lower income and Black, Indigenous, and people of color live, and overlaid that with data on where the most air pollution is. And there's a lot of similarities there. And that's just one example of how we're able to identify through data how those communities are disproportionately burdened by pollution.
Thank you. Anybody else want to weigh in before we move on to the next question? I think we've got that covered.
Well, I would just say also for folks that have different kinds of fuel sources that heat homes, there's indoor air quality is another factor. And if you're maybe on propane or oil or wood, or there's different kinds of fuel sources that can create more or less indoor air quality. And it's another thing where the fewer resources, older homes, different kinds of fuel sources are unequally distributed.
Great, thank you. Next question is for Andrea from Claudia from Ellensburg. Who would make the investment of solar panels, even with tax credits, and not want some compensation for energy back into the grid?
That's a great question. There's a fair number of questions that I saw folks were really thinking very carefully about, well, who's actually paying for, if it's is it philanthropy, is it government tax dollars? And is that really, there was a whole line of questions along those lines. And I think sometimes when we're thinking about solutions that are sort of, how do we do creative financing, and you can get someone can invest, but they'll get their money back, and it's a kind of not a for-profit scheme, but it's designed to pencil out. I think that whole set of thinking sometimes might not apply for those of us that our friends and neighbors that have the fewest advantages, that have a lot of things where they're very, very, very limited wealth. In that case, I'm sure not everybody would agree, but what we say is, well, as a society, generally, we have an obligation, and there's a different kinds of set of solutions that are pretty much going to cover it, and it would have to either be
like a specific revenue source that's sort of like those that benefit the most from fossil fuels or other things that we don't want to perpetuate have to pay a fee and then cover the cost of transition to clean energy for folks that have fewest advantages, or some other creative thing. But you're right that it doesn't really, it's not as so much of an economic incentive as it is sort of a, this is how we want to move forward generally as a society. So that would be my answer. It may not be satisfying to all, but that's what I think, because it's going to have to take sort of a piece of collective will rather than just an individual, how am I going to benefit?
Great. I'm going to take over some of the Q&A now, because I think Gretchen just ran into some technical challenges. But this is a follow-up question to that, and this is for Andrea or Pedro. So what's the cost to outfit a home with solar panels, and are wind turbines available for singular residential use?
Well, presently, the cost per dollar per watt for solar panels, it's between $2 and $3 per watt. So dollar per watt. And wind is actually lower than that. And that is the reason why, people are starting to think about buying themselves panels or small wind. And there is the federal and local government in Washington has a website which is giving in one of the references I put in my presentation. It's called DSIRE, Database of Incentives for Renewable Energy. And if you can go in there and you get it over 100 incentives. And I believe people will use that in order to purchase renewable energies, solar and wind. It's more wind.
I would add in that the cost has been going down and down and down for solar, but just to get a very ballpark figure, like, $7,000 might be a really great, you've got a lot of incentives stacked up and you still owe that much, maybe 10,000. Like, it's still a multi-$1,000 proposition to probably get solar. Don't quote me. I'm not very expert, but that's a very ballpark. It's a fair amount you might have to pay off. It might be a lot more efficient if or like you get more sort of, this is a bad expression, but bang for your buck if you were to maybe swap out a hot water heater for a very fuel efficient one, or one that uses new technologies. So there's, solar is still kind of expensive for the length of payout.
Great, thank you too. So this next question's for Annabelle from Angela from Vancouver. Are there any coalitions devoted to capturing or filtering transportation carbon emissions, either in retrofitting vehicles or filtering on current highway structures? And then a follow-up from Sue from Medical Late is there a way to put filters on freeways and high traffic areas, not just on cars, but to filter the air?
I don't know about broader pollution and emission capture over freeways and highways. I do know that there are some solutions, like retrofit solutions to diesel vehicles, where you can retrofit the engine and reduce pollution from diesel, which does have higher pollution than gasoline vehicles. But I'll also add that one of the pathways that we have that's really clear is to transition to zero emission vehicles, so we don't necessarily have to retrofit those engines or those tailpipes. Instead, we can just move to fuels that don't have any emissions at all.
Great, thanks, Annabelle. And then I have another question. Working from home encourages reduction in transportation. Could we suggest incentives for companies and individuals to encourage work from home?
I think, so the first part, one of the slides in my presentation talked about 2 pathways, and one was moving people and goods more efficiently and equitably. And I think this question and some other questions that were mentioned really relate to this. And it's not an area that I have a lot of expertise on, but it is incredibly vital as, you know, a huge section of complementary strategies to all of the emission reduction and decarbonization policies that I ran through, if that makes sense. So working from home, I think, is a great policy, and I think there's a lot of other folks who are better able to answer, you know, how we can incentivize that.
Great, thanks, Annabelle. So this next question is for you, Ali, from Kathy at Auburn. So there was a lot of discussion about how will car batteries be disposed of? And there's a lot of concern and questions about how disposal will be harmful to the environment. And there was also some questions and discussion around saltwater batteries. So do you want to provide any insight to batteries and battery disposals?
Sure, I think that's an ongoing sort of discussion. I think California, Oregon, their disposal and their sort of recycling plants are the best sort of guide for us right now. Remember, we are the last state to be joining the Clean Fuel Standard. Oregon and California and BC have already been doing this for years now. Not Oregon as much, they just passed last year, so let me take that back a little bit. But they have come up with recycling sort of ways to then recycle, reuse the batteries, and how to make it more effective. One thing that we're talking about in the zero waste sort of task force is how do we then take all of these green renewable uses of the new sort of electrification, how are we going to then regenerate it back into the system and make them usable again?
Great. All right, and we have one last question, and this is for you, Ali or Annabelle. Are there any policies or cities requiring publicly funded vehicles, such as police cars, ambulances, school buses, to go electric?
I know Washington has designated some of its funds for the state fleet through the Volkswagen Settlement Fund, which, if you all aren't familiar with, Volkswagen essentially misled consumers on their emissions in their diesel vehicles. And there was a major settlement, and they put a lot of money out, millions and millions of dollars to each state. And Washington's been able to reinvest some of that money and has designated some of those funds to transitioning the state fleet. And I know that some local jurisdictions have dedicated resources to transitioning their own fleets as well, although I'm not entirely sure what, you know, other funding has been dedicated to that, and I'm positive that more funding would be beneficial.
Great. Thank you. So we're out of time for questions. Thank you all again for coming in today and speaking with us. We did have a lot of questions in the chat. So this is just a reminder, both to our assembly members and to our presenters, that we'll be emailing all of these questions over the next few days for written answers. And this is, again, just an opportunity for assembly members to get a lot of the context and the answers as they move from the learning session to the deliberative session. So I'm going to turn this to Derek, and Derek mentioned earlier that we're going to do another Waterfall Chat exercise together as a group, and he's going to lead us through that now.
All right, hi again, folks. Really excited to be able to do another Waterfall Chat with you all, to give you a chance to share your thoughts on another prompt. So again, just as a reminder, for those that are able to type your answer into the chat, but don't hit enter yet. We'll do a countdown of 3, 2, 1, and everyone will hit enter at the same time, and that's very exciting to see that and to see what your fellow assembly members have to share. So the prompt is, if you were to make one recommendation to the state legislature right now, what would it be? It can be your own idea, or it could be one you heard during a learning session. And also just to remember that, you know, not only from this learning session, but from all of the learning sessions that we've had so far, as I said earlier, we're at that midway point. And so, you know, you can draw from anything that you have in your notes or that you remember or just what's coming up for you right now. But if you were to make one recommendation, what would that be? And just thinking also about the fact that we are heading toward the deliberative sessions, and we want to start thinking about what it is that each and every one of you want to bring forward. So we'll just take about 30 seconds to give you a chance to reflect and type your answer, but don't hit enter yet. All right, I'd love to see a thumbs up from folks if you are ready for this. See some people still typing. See a lot of thumbs up coming up. Thumbs up if you're ready. All right, we'll do this. Let's do a countdown. 3, 2, 1, go. All right, yeah, that's so exciting. So many good ideas and thoughts. Thanks so much for participating in Waterfall Chat. I think it's just a great way to hear from everyone right away. Please scroll through and take a look, and I'll hand it back for the next piece.
Gretchen, and we are great. We are going to move right into our campfire reflection, and then we'll just be in there for a few minutes, and then we will turn it over to one of the observers when we come back as a full group for an introduction to him and a survey that they are going to be asking folks to take. So heading right into the breakouts.
All right.
For any presenters still in the main room, you may want to turn your video off. Just this is being live streamed to YouTube, just so you're going to sit there on camera for a few minutes.
Great. And if we can spotlight Robert, that would be great. Robert Richards, can we spotlight him? Hi. And we've got everybody back. And Robert, I am going to turn it over to you both for you to introduce yourself. He is one of our observers. He's up on our website if you want to learn more. Robert, I'll turn it right over to you.
Thank you very much, Gretchen. Hi, my name is Robert Richards. I'm from the University of Arkansas School of Public Service, and I'm a member of the research team that's evaluating the assembly. The other research team members are Dr. Chul Park from the University of Arkansas and Dr. John Roundtree from the University of Houston downtown. We want to thank Gretchen and the coordinating team and the monitoring team for enabling us to evaluate the assembly. An important part of our evaluation is surveys of participants, which help us understand your experience of the assembly. The first survey, which we're using today, takes about 5 to 7 minutes to complete. Participation is completely voluntary. If you have questions about the survey, please feel free to contact me or to contact Dr. Chul Park, whose email is on the consent form, which you received in your welcome packet, and which is also linked on the first page of the survey. Completing the survey will help us improve the assembly and make adjustments to the assembly process so we can give you a better learning and discussion experience. We'd be most grateful if you take just a few minutes to complete this survey, the link to which I'm placing in the chat now.
Excellent. Thanks so much. So take a look at that survey, and it is, hugely beneficial to us. I appreciate Robert and his team for being willing to be observers and to help us improve this process for you all. So that link is in the survey. And with that, I will turn it over to Mike for just a couple minutes to do a really quick recap of our meeting objectives, where we're headed, and then we will also ask you for that 30-second chat response in terms of how you're doing at the end of this. Mike?
Great. Thanks, Gretchen. So again, just wanting to revisit about today's learning objectives. So we first heard from Eileen Quigley about Washington's greenhouse gas emissions and how the Pacific Northwest and Washington State specifically can utilize some key strategies, including energy efficiency, cleaner electricity, electrification, utilizing low carbon fuels, and carbon capture as ways to achieve some of the decarbonization. So building off of Eileen's presentation, we heard about 3 specific sectors today. First, on energy, we heard from Nancy Hirsch on current energy utilities, where energy comes from currently, the history of policies in our state that have made the utility sector more sustainable, and opportunities in how the state can create a more harmonious and sustainable system. We heard from Andrea Axel about the Green Divide and examples of how community projects can support local community sustainability, and some of the lessons learned both in how the state can continue supporting communities all across the state. And finally, we heard from Pedro on the topic of energy, hearing from a local perspective about how renewable energy and some of the technologies can really help individual households or communities achieve renewable and low carbon energy goals. We also learned about buildings, so thinking about how much heat and energy do our homes or workplaces use. We also, from Kate Simonen, Kate also brought up about thinking about the entire life cycle of a building. So from the materials creation to the end of life for a building, and what are some of the policy opportunities within existing buildings, new buildings, our electrical grid, and the building materials themselves. And Kate also offered the upcoming legislation, the Buy Clean, Buy Fair Washington Act, which is currently being considered. And finally, we learned about transportation. So we heard from Annabelle Drayton on what's currently in place for transportation, opportunities for transportation electrification, and how that connects to the Washington State greenhouse gas sources. And we heard about the Clean Fuel Standard legislation, or House Bill 1091 from Representative Fitzgibbon and Ali Lee. So with that, if you want to put in the chat quickly how you're feeling, and I'll hand it over to Gretchen to just wrap us up.
Excellent. Well, thank you all for your active listening and active participation in the questions. We're at 1 o'clock, And we'd love for you just to take one moment, just want to thank all our speakers, but most importantly, thank all of you assembly members for staying engaged in your Saturday, 3 hours of your day. Thank you all so much. And if you can just share in one word or less how you're feeling, not less than one word or a couple more words than that, how you're feeling about the assembly and kind of where you're at right now in this moment. So we've got lucky, hopeful, glad we're getting a deeper dive into carbon emissions, more educated, inspired, flustered, happy to hear from everybody, and wiser after every session, muy bueno, well-informed. Thank you all so much. Have a wonderful rest of your weekend. Thanks again, and we look forward to seeing you all on Tuesday at 6 p.m. for our next learning session. Have a great weekend.
Can I ask you a question?
Can you ask it in the chat, Milton?
Okay.
I'm gonna formally close for now, but that would be great. Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you so much for having us.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you
Feel free to
all.
unmute yourself.